Well, welcome to Questioning Christianity. My name is Dan Patterson, and our channel here is all about helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. My guest for this episode is Dr. David Wood. David has his PhD in philosophy from Fordham University, where he focused on the problem of evil. But David is best known for his engagement with Islam. He's debated some of the best Islamic scholars in the world. He's critiqued Islam very publicly, and he's very helpful at answering many of the objections that you have in this area. So, David, it's a great delight to have you on the channel, mate.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Mate, there are a bunch of things that I want to talk about in this live stream. Certainly your own conversion story and your experience of being diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, your friendship with our mutual mate, Nabil Qureshi, and how he came to face, and the story that many may be familiar with his life as well. But then turning to most of where you spend your time, which is engaging the world's second largest religion, Islam. And a lot of the arguments for Islam, the normal critiques of Christianity from popular Muslim apologists. We'll play a bunch of TikTok videos, but also welcome others to, in the live chat, ask away with their questions as they jump in, and we'll move through as many as we possibly can. For those of you who are just joining in live, we're going to have an opportunity over the next 2 hours to be able to ask as many questions as we want to David, as many as we can get through at least. So please do pop them in the chat as you jump in. And as always, if you want to be able to bump up the priority, you're very welcome to support the channel by offering a super chat. We've got a bunch of great links towards David's work down there in the show notes, and we'll talk about them as we wander through. But David, if we could kick off just with a little bit of your story, mate. You have this brilliant testimony video that you filmed a number of years ago. It's sort of this one take of you wandering down into the subway system and sort of talking about the descent of your own life and storytelling along the way of your experience of atheism and your own diagnosis, but then also your experience of becoming a Christian and then kind of wandering up into the light at the end. I thought it was brilliant. Just a question for public consumption. Was that a one take experience? Because it's flawless in its delivery.
Yeah, it's the video's I think 34 minutes long, and we got it one take, and we got it on the first try. So that was cool. It's not like we just walked into a tunnel one day and did that. We actually, I went through and planned it out and stuff. I was just I thought of the idea from Plato's allegory of the cave, and I was like, I like how he's illustrating what he's talking about by having this little a story about a guy going underground and stuff. And so I had the idea, and I went and looked through some of the stations in New York, because we lived in the Bronx. So I was in the subway pretty regularly. So I looked through stations, and I couldn't find anything that worked as far as I wanted, like going down multiple levels and then riding. So I found a station that goes down multiple levels, but then it wouldn't go anywhere that made any sense as far as like time wise. Like, okay, well, I have to be on the train 18 minutes before I get anywhere and stuff like that. Anyway, so didn't work. And then I was just got invited to speak in some I think Korean church in Queens, I believe. So I'd taken the train over there. It was on the way back that I went through that station where it just kept escalator after escalator kept getting lower, and I was like, oh, this might work for a station. So anyway, just looked around, planned it out there, got my friend who's a camera guy to follow me around, and we did it.
The storytelling in that way was just brilliant, just thinking about picture and aspect. And did you have any interesting in-look? Because I've done a bit of public filming for some spoken word videos that we've done, and I just remember everyone kind of looking at you quizzically going, what's going on here?
Oh, yeah. No, it was way worse than you could tell on the camera, because it was mainly by the time I got down, I was walking through the sort of long tunnel where it was dark, like a little crowd was forming behind the camera, right? Because at first you get people's attention when they see someone walking by and a camera following. They're like, what's going on here? And then I'm walking by and they hear me saying all this crazy stuff. So they actually start following. They actually start following as a group. It was just like, it was horribly distracting, because I know they didn't hear what was going on before. I know they're not going to hear the end. So all they hear me is saying that all they hear is me saying all this crazy stuff. And so there's a camera pointing at me. I'm looking at the camera, and there's people standing behind it, following and listening. And it was like, by the time at the end, I didn't know if what I said was coherent, because I don't remember what I was saying, because it was so distracting as people staring right in my face. Yeah. Anyway, worked
Well,
out.
we can let everyone be the judge of that. The link's down in the show notes. Go and check it out. It is really powerful storytelling. And I think they'd really appreciate getting that window into kind of the beginning and end of you spelling out your experiences. But maybe one thing that will shock people who haven't come across you before, David, is that you were diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, which is basically shorthand for a sociopath. When did you realize as a kid growing up that you weren't exactly like all the other kids?
Very, very early on. So I share that a little bit in my video. The first time, the first time I saw it was with my mom when my dog got run over by a bus, and my mom started crying, and I couldn't figure out why she was crying. Like it made no sense to me. Why are you crying? That's not changing anything. What's the point of that? And then we were living somewhere else like 2 years later, and we had kind of like we're living with a family, and we had sort of this household dog and so on. And that dog got run over, and I saw the other kids crying. And these are like all like bigger, older kids that were like super cool and tough, and they were crying. And I was like, wait a minute, what? I thought it was my mom who was weird. Now all of you guys are like bawling. Keep in mind, like from an outsider perspective, it makes no sense. Like people don't understand how little sense this. It's normal for people. If it weren't normal for you, you'd think it's weird. Like if you went to some island where there's this lost tribe that's never had any contact, and you went to the island and something happened, like someone gives birth and everyone starts, let's say, oozing earwax out of their ears, you'd be like, what is that? That's so weird. Why are you oozing what does earwax have to do with what's going on? It makes no sense, right? And so there's no connection between something bad happening and like the salty goop coming out of your eyes. And so anyway, it just seemed really really weird. But I realized people are reacting differently to things than I was.
And what's that like, having atypical emotional responses? And so you're growing up trying to navigate your environment and just realizing, hey, everyone else is responding to things. I don't feel the same things. Was that odd for you?
Well, you after noticing it, you start thinking about it. And so again, if you're looking at people moaning and wailing and like being upset over all these things that happen, and you're not, you don't sit back and think, wow, I'm the messed up one here. You think, I'm kind of better than all you. I don't have these normal, I don't have the completely insane, nonsensical reactions that the rest of you have. And therefore I lack your weakness. So you guys are all weak in some weird way that you think
it starts feeling like a superpower.
Yeah, that's exactly what it feels like.
Yeah. And I mean, really heavy story, but part of your testimony video recounts the moment where you tried to kill your dad. Hit him in the face with a hammer, and that resulted with you going to prison for, I think it was a 10-year sentence or thereabouts, of which you served 6. And it's in prison.
Little over 5, just
a little over 5. Yeah.
Back in the day, if you this isn't the law anymore, but back then in the 90s, if you had a 10-year sentence, for every 30 days you didn't get in trouble, they'd give you 30 days of what's called good time. And that was stuff they could kind of hold over your head. And so if you ever got in trouble again, they could say, well, we're giving you back that time. So it was kind of an incentive to keep people out of trouble while they're locked up. We'll take time off your sentence if you stay out of trouble, which I did. Yeah. So
yeah, it's a good motivator. But it's in prison that you became a Christian. And I think for a lot of people, the normal experience of becoming a Christian actually involves some kind of emotional response to a sense of guilt. I mean, part of the Bible story recounts that the Holy Spirit's role is to convict us in regards to sin and judgment, but also an experience of divine love and grace in some kind of encounter with God. What was that experience of you becoming a Christian in prison like with your condition?
It wasn't. There's no remorse involved. That's kind of a problem with the disorder. Matter of fact, I've had Christians. It's pretty rare, but I've had Christians. David, if you had a real conversion, then you would have been crying when you're sharing that story and stuff like that. I don't. I don't even know what you guys are talking about when you're talking about like feeling, like remorse as a feeling. So anyway, yeah, I lack those kind of feeling. I can still recognize that I'm wrong. It's just, it's not a
Mm.
feeling. So anyway, in jail, it was, I got into a series of arguments with a Christian who was in there. He was in there he turned himself in for 21 felonies. And so he's in there, and I started it with him. I walked up to him and I was like, because he was reading his Bible on his bunk, and I walked up to him and said, "Hey, you know what? You're reading your Bible. You're reading the Bible because you're born in the United States. If you've been born somewhere else, you believe in something else." And started going after him like that. But he actually put up a fight, and Christians didn't do that when I was growing up, and I'd start arguing with them. They would back down, and we don't want to argue over this. We don't want to argue over this. But he actually would, and so we were in a dorm together, and after a while, took a while, but I eventually got placed in an observation cell. They thought I was trying to kill. This guy was doing fasting, and every time he would fast, I would out fast him by a couple days. But I just kept getting, like, I went from probably 235 pounds when I got locked up down to about 150. So they actually they thought I was trying to starve myself to death. And I'd been in a couple of mental hospitals. So they thought I was snapping and just killing myself really, really slowly. So anyway, they stuck me back in the cell. And in the cell, I was thinking, oh, cool, I'll study all this stuff and go back and refute this Christian guy. But anyway, it was mainly it was a combination of a couple of things. There were like a couple of arguments that interested me, which I thought I was figuring these out for myself. I didn't realize these were already arguments. So Randy, that's the Christian guy's name. He'd given me some stuff on scientists. It was a Christian chemist who was arguing about design and nature. Didn't take that very seriously, but the things that started bothering me were, one, I was just sitting in my cell and I was looking at the blocks on the wall, and they started, I started thinking, if someone told me these bricks went into this arrangement by themselves, then I would think that, the person's an idiot. But here I believe that life, which, any living cell in your body, any living cell that exists at all, is massively more complicated and sophisticated than a bunch of bricks stacked on top of each other. So I started thinking about those, like I was a little inconsistent. Like, why did I just kind of mindlessly accept that in school when they said, yeah, life can come together like this, and you accept it. So that started bothering me. The evidence for the resurrection started bothering me, because before that, I thought I'd had Christianity figured out. Like, okay, your guy dies, you want to keep the movement going, make up a story about him rising from the dead and so on. But it was Randy had told me, and then he gave me a copy of Fox's Book of Martyrs on how the apostles died. And that was starting to bother me, because I tried to think of one person in history who knowingly died for something he knew that he made up. And I couldn't think of anyone. And so, like, what are the odds that a bunch of these guys, a bunch of the followers of Jesus, are all these guys who just will make something up and then go to their horrible, bloody deaths over it? So that was starting to bother me. And then there was a kind of weird version of the moral argument, where by that time I thought I was like the most advanced human being who ever lived, because everyone else has all these stupid emotional weaknesses and so on.
Yeah.
And so I thought that I was like the pinnacle of human evolution by that point. And at some point I realized that I saw the inconsistency between I'm the greatest, most important human being who ever lived, and life is all just completely meaningless, and it's all just particles in motion. I understood there's a conflict. If I'm the greatest, most important human being who ever lived, then there's some kind of like standard of greatness. And if there is, then what are the odds that I'm actually it? Or if there's none, if there is no standard out there, then how am I at all better than anyone else? Didn't make any sense. So anyway, I was just all the stuff that I believed when I was growing up started breaking down and not making sense. And it just got to a point where I went in a very short period of time from thinking that I was the greatest person in the world to thinking I was the worst person in the world. Like, it kind of hits you. I'm sitting here on my bed, drooling, I've got a rash all over me, and I'm about to be sent to my third mental hospital because they think I'm trying to kill myself because I'm trying to beat the Christian. And just realize, like, what kind of lunatic am I that I think I'm the greatest person in the world? Anyway, once you get to that point, once you like hit like absolute bottom, you know, it's a bad place to be, but kind of the only place to go is to stay there or go back up. Anyway, I started thinking, okay, well, if I am this really, really messed up people, then I basically there are two possibilities here. Either I'm stuck like this, it's just the way I am, or there's someone out there that can help people like me. And I was reading the Gospel of John right then to refute the Christian. And it was basically a situation of what have I got to lose if this could be true. I didn't think it would. If you go back a year, I thought it was complete, insane, idiotic nonsense. At this point, it was okay. If it's anyone, it's Jesus. If anyone can do this sort of thing, if anyone actually has this kind of power, it's Jesus. So it's that or nothing. And so it was kind of a situation like, what if I pray? And it turns out that I find out later that it's false. So it's not like I made myself worse. I've already concluded I'm the worst person in the world. So what if I what if I pray and so on? So I did. And anyway, things changed right there.
When you say that you feel like you're the worst person in the world, part of that feels like a moral judgment. Is there just abstract reasoning associated with that? Or is there this feeling within you that's like, oh, I'm curious?
It was an observation. It was, I am sitting here in a cell, starving. They bring me food every day and I'm starving. And again, I couldn't stop. It's if you haven't eaten for a while, some people like their mouth your mouth won't stop salivating stuff and you get sick of like spitting. So I just like put a cup beside my bunk and I would just like hung my head over the side of the bed and just let the drool run into a cup. I got this rash all over my body. It's shingles, which if you don't eat a lot, shingles is just the reactivation of the chickenpox virus, which is always in your body. And if you don't eat a long time, this is my experience. If you don't eat a long time, you're getting a vitamin deficiency and then it reactivates it and so on. So it feels just like poison ivy, just like constantly scratching myself and drooling and scratching myself and drooling and sitting there thinking about torturing people. And it was just like, how on what basis am I the greatest person? How? I mean, there are people who are I'm sitting here starving, even though they bring me food. There's starving people in the world, but I mean, at least they can think straight. I sit around thinking about torturing people all day. And, there are people who can't think straight, but they don't have the rash all over. It's just like, name all the different ways you could be more messed up than other people. I'm all of those. I'm all of the things. I'm all of the things. So this makes no sense. It's like you put it all together. I'm a guy in a cell drooling and gonna spend who knows how long locked up because I hadn't been sentenced at that point, and maybe gonna go be sitting in a mental hospital and stuff. And like, where did I get this idea that this is somehow greatness? And so anyway, I just realized that basically everything I believed about everything and about myself just broke down in a short period of time.
And what changed then when you started praying? So you made this calculation, like, look, it can't get worse. I may as well pray, see if this makes a difference. What happened?
Well, I sat up from that prayer and everything looked different. Like the whole world looked different. Like it had all changed colors. And I'd had a brief experience of that before when this was earlier when I was in jail and they were taking me to another mental hospital for tests and so on. And so they were taking me, but I'd been locked in a cell for, I don't know how long, couple months or something like that. I'd been in a cell and there was no window, couldn't see outside. And all of a sudden they take you outside to take you to a mental hospital and just seeing like trees and stuff after not seeing them for a while, just seeing trees and wow, walk over bridge and stuff like this. It was all like amazing. It was like you were seeing it and you don't realize how amazing it is because it's normal to you. And then you get taken away from it. All of a sudden, whoa, a tree. And so is that kind of experience. But then it was just when I became a Christian, it was just looking around. It was like everything was like that. Everything was like, it was, I don't know, it was weird. It was like amazing. It was amazing. And so that was one thing. The other thing was like my view of other people just changed instantly. Like it was like I viewed human beings as like these disgusting little meaningless blobs of futility. And so, I mean, just think you got this giant universe and there's this little tiny speck that's our sun. And then there's this little piece of dust going around at the earth and these little blobs of cells crawling all over it, thinking they're so important. Like it's so stupid to me. And all of a sudden it went from no, we're created by God, and therefore I can't treat people in the way I've treated them before.
Totally. And curious to parse out then a little bit more of your experience since becoming a Christian. So you're in jail for just over 5 years. You get out, you go back to university then, and that's where you meet Marie, who's now your wife. What was that experience like? Because part of that involves her becoming a Christian across those university years as well.
Yeah, I met her. Nabil and I were arguing about the resurrection. So Nabil and I were arguing in an airport about the resurrection. And she walks up and says, "You're both right." And it was interesting because Nabil and I were like in full argument mode. And we both turned to her and we're like, "No, look, okay, there are two possibilities here. Either I'm saying he rose from the dead. He's saying he didn't rise from the dead. Either he didn't rise or he rose. Those are the only two possibilities here. So one of us is right and the other's wrong. Under no circumstances are we both right." And what she meant, she was kind of like a friendly agnostic in the sense of, whatever you believe is true for you, that sort of thing. So, hey, if it's true for you that Jesus rose and true for you that Jesus didn't rise, and it's all just your religious belief. So stop arguing about it. Anyway, so we started arguing, and it was interesting because she would say something, I would say, "Oh yeah, read this book, check out this book, this would," but she would like go home and read it and then come back and argue.
She actually did it. That's awesome.
In 2 weeks, she read 5 apologetics books. She read 5 apologetics books in 2 weeks, just to argue, just as we're arguing and so on. And
does she reflect back on that and say it's less about the argument and more about wanting to beat you or interested in you, or was it just a pursuit for the truth for her?
Yeah, she was sort of like she'd been raised as a Catholic and got to college and just, okay, that stuff isn't true. And going through, so she went through those 5 books and so on. And then I remember we were sitting there arguing, and all of a sudden she just like burst into tears. And I'm like, "What? There's no crying and arguing. What are you doing? It's what? I'm like, can I not argue?
That's a cheat code.
Can I not argue with girls? What's going on? Are they just going to cry whenever whenever things get heated?" But she told me later she realized too, like, "Oh my goodness, I believed all this stuff because my professors told it to me and I didn't look into it. And then I bought into it all." And she was just realized, wow, I found out that I was wrong about all this stuff and that I like betrayed God and stuff. And so she started crying, but, yep. And, I proposed like after 2 months or something like that. And yeah, so those were good times.
Here we are a couple of decades later. And you guys have had sort of 5 kids as well, 5 sons. I've got 3 sons. So I'm intimately familiar with the boy house experience. But for those who haven't had much of an experience of sociopathy beyond the movies, when you speak about being a husband and a father, what's that experience like?
It is, there are lots of things going on. So one, the kind of, I guess, negative side is like anytime my kids have gotten in trouble, I was always like, she's like, "Oh, he didn't do his homework." And I'm like, "Well, I started a forest fire when I was his age. So how am I going to,
the levels aren't that bad. He's doing fine.
He's doing all right." And I would always tell my kids, even if I'm like blasting them for not doing their homework or something like that, I'm like, "Guys, just to be clear, by my family standards, you are all saints. You are complete saints." So these are kind of minor things, but you still have to work on these. You still have to work on these minor things. But I do have, there are downsides. Like, I don't know, I'm kind of a workaholic. So it's always in my mind, even if I'm just like playing with my kids, there's a part of me that feels like I'm wasting time and no, I have to be going and doing something and so on. So it's not like this, great feeling about being around kids and so on. So there are those negative sides that you don't have the same emotional attachments as other. To be clear, I love all my kids and so on. I'm just being honest. There are still downsides to having issues and so on. So anyway, you kind of have to, hey, I feel like I need to be accomplishing something and not just playing with my kid on the floor or something like that. But no, stop that. You have to do it. You have to do that anyway. It's part of being a dad. So there's a lot of that. There's like, what am I supposed to do? Not what do I feel like doing or something like that, because I never feel like I need to do those things. So it's what am I, what do I have to do as a dad, and so on. So anyway, yeah.
And who got naming rights out of the two of you? Because at least a few of them I'm following, sort of early Christian scientists. How did you decide?
That was both of us. My wife was I think she was a triple major in biology, psychology, and philosophy. So we were both taking philosophy classes. So yeah, we would include the name of a Christian philosopher or scientist in all their names somewhere. But yeah, no, that was total agreement.
I love that.
Actually, our second son Blaze, we wanted to name him, his first name Judah. We liked the name Judah. We had just watched Ben-Hur. I was like, hey, let's name our kid Judah after the guy in Ben-Hur. And her mom came to me, and her mom said, that sounds like Judas. And so mom's
too close.
Mom's
That's
nice,
one letter difference.
Yeah, mom's nice Catholic, and I was like, no, it's Judah, and we're going to call him Jude. And she just kept going, no, it sounds like Judas. And anyway, I was like, well, too bad. That's his name. Get used to it. And then it was sometime right before he was born. She walked up to me. She goes, I'll give you $1,000 to change the name. And I go,
done.
Write the check. Write the check.
Yeah, that's plenty. I actually would love to track, if anyone watching this is familiar with like the onomastic study that helps to confirm the eyewitness status of much of what's in the New Testament Gospels. But let's look at how many names from that first period of the 1st century in ancient Judea actually match the names represented in the Gospels. I'd love to see the drop in the number of people being named Judas as all of a sudden Christianity becomes more popular. I feel like it's going to be an Adolf where it just gets written out of history in that respect.
Mm-hmm.
So question, have you seen the Chosen series?
No, not one. Nope, not one.
No, one of the interesting features I think that people might be curious about is in the story itself, the producers, directors have decided to cast Matthew, or the tax collector, one of Jesus's disciples, as being himself on the autism spectrum. And I'm curious about, as you're reading the biblical story, whether or not experiences that you've had with your own diagnosis, you're noticing behaviors or characteristics of a certain kind of biblical characters that you're like, I wonder.
I mean, as far as you kind of touched on this a little bit ago, but as far as like sociopaths, psychopaths, those are names for people with antisocial personality disorder. They don't mean it's not like in the movies, in that you can have a psychopath who goes around killing and slaughtering people because he doesn't have any sort of emotional attachments to other people. He doesn't care. He doesn't care about chopping people's heads off and so on. It doesn't make him feel bad in any way. So you can end up being a serial killer, but you can end up. I guarantee you, some of the people who are CEOs in some of the biggest companies in the world are psychopaths.
Well, they've done a positive correlation with that. I mean, there's sociopathic tendencies, which I think are roughly 3% of the population, and that's a moving spectrum.
Yeah,
but the correlation with CEOs is nuts, because you have to, like you said, just devote yourself in a huge way and bear any other personal cost in the background.
And you don't care who you trample on the way up there, and you don't care how you're making everyone suffer around you as you're pursuing it and so on. So, it's basically every time you walk through the mall, you're probably walking by a couple of psychopaths, high functioning psychopaths who are, who've learned to live. But anyway, I mean, I don't, there are people, you could point to someone if you're going around killing people or something like that, you could suspect it, but I don't know if I would think, I don't know if I would sit there and say, okay, Paul was a psychopath who's going around, because he definitely has some other features that don't sound like that. So I wouldn't.
Yeah. His letters don't bear that out, do they?
Yeah. And so there's that, but reading the Bible, you do see other things, like here would be my thinking. So it's just built into me for my entire life that like, crying is weakness, and that's stupid, and it makes you there's something wrong. There's something wrong with you.
Mm.
But what do you do when you see, Jesus in the story of Lazarus and it says Jesus wept? It's like, okay, well, he's obviously better than I am, and he's weeping.
Good
So
inference.
if that guy's weeping and I'm not, then
Mm.
I'm the one with the problem. I'm the one with the problem,
Mm.
not him. And matter of fact, I tell people that because I get messages like, "Hey, I think my son might be might be a sociopath or
Mm.
something
Well,
like
we
this."
we were together last year. I remember we were doing a live stream in San Antonio, and someone came in and brought that question. Hey, I think my son might have this sort of tendencies. What would I do? And I found what you shared so helpful, because you said, look, I thought it was a superpower, and it was
Yeah,
really important to me to realize actually this is something that's missing. This normal way of
yeah.
engaging the world. This is part of the fall rather than part of something worth celebrating.
Yeah, I tell people that's like the most important. That's like the most important thing, because if you think you're the best and you're superior to everyone else, you don't need help. You don't need to. You've got nothing to fix. They've all got the problem. They're the ones with the problem. If you at some point realize, whoa, actually, I'm defective here, and so that's one of the takeaways for realizing Jesus is who he is. That now you're not comparing yourself to other people, and you don't have some sort of like standard to go by. Now you're comparing yourself to Jesus, and well, if I'm different from him, then I'm the one with the problem, not him. And so it's kind of one of the most important steps is getting to see it as a defect rather than as something that makes you greater than everyone else.
That's really helpful. Talk to me about our mutual friend Nabil Qureshi, because I met Nabil when I joined the same team he was working on back in 2014. I actually went over to be best man at a wedding in Atlanta, and so Erin and my wife and I, stayed with Nabil and Michelle and had a blast. But I only knew him in those last few years of his life. What was that experience like? Obviously, meeting in college days and debating between Christianity and Islam for a few years, and seeing him become a Christian. What was that experience like for you?
Oh, I mean, that was really fun, awesome times. And it's kind of a weird situation where I read like in the Gospels where Jesus would send them out two by two. And so I was like, hey, it'd be cool if I had like, like someone else to roll with. And I was thinking, well, I'm a former atheist. It'd be cool, like a former Muslim. It'd be cool to team up with a former Muslim. And then we go out like, by twos and so on. And anyway, then Nabil walks into the speech and debate team that we were both interested in. And I was like, oh, hey, maybe this is that guy. And so, yeah, we ended up the first trip we went on, we ended up staying up all night arguing back and forth about Christianity and Islam. And but we actually, we became really good friends, that's kind of the best scenario to be in with a Muslim, because if you're arguing, it's very easy to be arguing with someone and then you don't want to be around them anymore because you guys realize, oh, all we do is argue. It's good that we became best friends, because then if you're criticizing your friend, then it doesn't come across as I hate you and I want to see you destroyed. Whereas if lots of Muslims interpret it like that. If you're like, hey, I don't believe in Muhammad because this, and that, they think you're like attacking them personally and that you hate them when you're trying to help them. It's like, hey, I'm trying to show you that this guy's not a true prophet and that you need to be examining these things a little more closely. But when it's your friend, then you can kind of be, hey, what's going on with this? What's going on with that? This is wrong. That's wrong. And because he's your friend, he's got your best interest at heart. He's not actually he's not doing this out of anger or hatred or anything. So no, those were good times. We spent years going through this stuff and we were really into it. I mean, we're in school, so we had to do that. But I mean, we'd get together and say, okay, let's get together and let's read this book before we get together this weekend. Let's both read this book. And then we'll take notes on it and put our arguments together, and we'll get together and go through it. We'd watch a debate, and then we'd sit there and discuss it point by point and so on. And we were doing this for it was about 4 years, before he eventually became a Christian. But and there were Christians back then who were telling me, like, why are you spending so much time with this one guy? Why are you spending so much time with this one guy? I mean, how many people could you be talking to? And day after day, you're arguing with this one guy. And I was just like, look, if he keeps coming back, if we argue and I'm blasting away at the points he's raising and he keeps coming back, I'm just going to be under the assumption that he's being drawn by the Spirit of God. And who am I to say you're taking too long here? I'm not going to do it. So, yeah.
We got a question in here from Gabe. He said, what would you say is the most practical way for Christians to evangelize or share about Jesus with Muslims? I often feel that I'm smashing my head into a wall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that as well. And think about what I was just saying. 4 years, for 4 years before Nabil became a Christian. And so, yeah, part of it is understanding like the psychological barriers that they have in front of them. So Muslims are taught from the day they're born that the worst possible sin you can commit is shirk. So saying that Jesus is Lord, that is the unpardonable sin in Islam. And so they're told believing in Jesus in that way, that Jesus is Lord, is a one-way ticket to hell. They're taught that all their lives. They understand that if they're going to leave Islam and become a Christian, very frequently they're going to lose their families. I don't just mean mom and dad. I mean aunts, uncles, cousins, all of that. The community will, at first, it's very common for the community to try and win them back. So, hey, let's go talk to these scholars. That's what Nabil's dad did for about a year after he became a Christian, to try to kind of win them back to Islam. But after that, it's, we don't want anything to do with you. Fortunately, Nabil continued having it was a little more strained, but he continued having a good relationship with his family. But more common to just, hey, don't come back here until you're a Christian, or just like nonstop hostility. But they understand that. They understand it's built into them. This is what would happen if I ever left Islam. And of course, there's the penalty for leaving Islam, which is beheading. And fortunately, doesn't happen a lot in the West because you don't have the legal system to support that. But you always have to be wondering, hey, what if someone obeys Muhammad's command, where Muhammad says, if anyone leaves his Islamic religion, kill him? What if someone actually obeys that command? So anyway, point is, it's like, that's a lot. There's a lot of psychological barriers keeping someone in Islam. So when you're trying to share the gospel with them and you're going, why isn't this person getting this? Why isn't this person understanding this? Why is this taking so long? Well, there's a reason. That person's in a really, really difficult spot. So it's good to keep that stuff in mind. And also, even as the person is having doubts about Islam, there's this tendency in Islam to compensate by becoming more devout, or at least appearing more devout. Because if you're having these inward doubts, these inward struggles about, hey, is this true? Is this true? Then it's just, Nabil did this. Like, as we're arguing, he was appearing to become a more and more confident Muslim, and he's arguing. He didn't tell me till later. It was like tearing him up inside. Finding out all this stuff about Muhammad was just ripping him apart inside. But again, once you realize that, you start feeling like you're a bad Muslim, so you compensate by acting more confident and stuff. So you can sit. The point there, Gabe, is you can be having these discussions with Muslims, and it will seem like it's having no impact at all. It will seem like it has no impact at all, even if it is. So in other words, even if it is having an impact, it looks like it's having no impact. So it seems like you're smashing your head into a wall, even if you're not. So as far as the most practical way, I made a video a while back. This was on my old channel, so you'd have to find it on an archive site, but you can look it up pretty easily. It's titled "How to Share Unpleasant Facts with Pleasant Muslims," and it's about starting discussions with Muslims. And it's actually pretty easy, because lots of Muslims would love to talk to you about Islam and would love to show you that Christianity is wrong and so on. So you just kind of have to open the door. And then once you get started, you can, just by asking them questions, find out what they believe and ask more questions, and as far as their reasons for believing that. And then you know that particular Muslim's reasons, and then research those reasons and get into discussions on that. And pretty straightforward. Done that over and over again.
Super helpful. Mate, what was it like then? I mean, we all walked through that experience of saying goodbye to Nabil. What was that like for you, sort of that 9-10 months from his diagnosis through to the last day that we got to say goodbye?
Yeah, there were actually lots of things going on there. So when he actually texted me and said, at that point, he had stage 4 cancer, but the preliminary diagnosis said stage 3B or something like that. And so he said, "Hey, I just found out I've got stage 3B stomach cancer, and I have to go to a specialist to find out the official thing." Anyway, he sent me that in a text, and so I looked up the prognosis for that stage of cancer, and it was not good. And so anyway, I texted him back, "Oh, that sucks." And then that was it. I went back to what I was doing. And later I was walked into the living room and Marie was there and I go, "Hey, Nabil's got a stage 3 stomach cancer." And she just instantly started like sobbing. And then I was thinking, uh-oh. So I supposed to react more than that? And she says, "Did you call him?" And I said, "No, I texted him. That sucks." And she says, "You need to call him." And I say, "Why? I wouldn't want anyone calling me if I got cancer. I would want everyone to leave me alone." And she says, "You're not Nabil." And so I said, "Oh, okay, well, let's call him." And so then anyway, we called him up and so on. So there was that sort of thing where you basically, if you're growing up without normal emotional reactions, you learn to kind of imitate things. But when you're put into different situations, like your friend gets cancer, you haven't been through that before. And so you haven't picked up on exactly what you're supposed to do. So anyway, had to learn that on the go. But later on, after he died, it was at his funeral where everyone was in a line to walk up to the families. And so Nabil's parents were there. And I'd had a rough time with Nabil's parents because they loved me when Nabil was still a Muslim. And then when he became a Christian, they really, 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 really didn't like me because in Islam, you can't really acknowledge that someone examined the evidence and left Islam and became a Christian. You can't entertain that thought. There always has to be some ulterior motive because you can't believe that someone could look at the evidence, which as a Muslim you think is so clear and it so clearly points to Islam. You can't get your mind around the idea of someone examining all the evidence and saying, you know what, Islam is false and Christianity is true, and becoming a Christian. So there's always something else involved. So other people, when they hear someone has left Islam and become a Christian, they say, oh, it was for money, or oh, it was for this, or oh, it was for that. Nabil's parents couldn't say that. They knew him. They knew Nabil. They knew Nabil wasn't like that. He wasn't doing this for money or anything. So they had to blame something else. And back then, they blamed me, like I'm some champion brainwasher who brainwashed him, and so on. So anyway, they weren't crazy about me, and I was always like, so what, So I don't care if you don't like it. So anyway, we did not have a good relationship after that, and so I didn't even know if I should walk up to them at the funeral and like hug them or something like that. I didn't know if I was going to be more of a bother to them. But anyway, I was like, I decided to go up there. And then when I when I walked up to them, I sort of leaned into Nabil's dad and I said, "I'm sorry for the way I've treated you." And what I mean there is, I was not, I showed them no grace for what they were going through, because that is a big deal in Islam. One of your children leaves Islam. That is like heartbreaking. I mean, Nabil told me that that was the only time he ever saw his dad cry, was when his dad found out that he'd become a Christian. It's the only time. And his dad told him, he said, "I feel like my spine has been ripped out of me right now." So, the fact that I didn't show any sort of, sympathy towards them or something like that. Anyway, I apologized to his dad. I said, "I'm sorry for the way I've treated you," and so on. And then I started oozing tears out of my eyes. And it was super weird. And I took like 5 steps and then it just stopped. But anyway, yeah, that's what was going on. So it wasn't Nabil's dad. I mean, it wasn't Nabil dying. It was something about talking to his family. That was like that was my first like emotional reaction to Nabil. What he was going through was like talking to his parents. So anyway, weird stuff.
Yeah. I'm just trying to fix my camera. I'll be back on in a sec. But I'm curious, you went on to study in your PhD, the problem of evil, which most people know you from your work with Islam. We'll get there in just a minute. But the problem of evil is obviously a huge philosophical question, but often has a ton of emotional hurdles attached to it. What drew you to study that particular area?
A couple things. One, I like the idea of something you can. There are certain issues where they're recent enough to where you can actually read everything written on a topic. That's not the case in lots of situations. In other words, if you wanted to study some particular topic and there's been thousands of essays and books written on it over the years. You can't actually like master the topic. But I noticed just from philosophy of religion classes and so on that so you had the problem of evil that always comes up, and that there are different versions of the argument from evil, and it's actually an area where there's been progress in the realm of philosophy. In that, if you go back to like the 1950s and before, the problem of evil is presented as like call it now the logical problem of evil, in the sense that if you believe that there's a God with certain attributes, then the very existence of evil is a contradiction, because you have a God who, if he's all powerful, he would have the power to stop evil. If he's perfectly good, he would want to stop evil. If he's omniscient, he's all knowing, then he knows exactly how to stop evil. Therefore, if there's evil, it makes no sense. It makes no sense. So you can't have this sort of being and evil. And so it's presented like that. And then people like Alvin Plantinga and so on responded and showed that it's not a contradiction. And therefore, the entire direction of the argument turned to what's now called the evidential or the inductive argument from evil. And the argument there is not that there's a contradiction between God and evil. It's that evil, at least certain kinds and maybe the amount of evil, is evidence against the existence of God. Anyway, so that became that became the popular version of the argument in the 1980s and 1990s in the realm of philosophy. But philosophers started poking that one full of holes, and they started pointing out all kinds of problems with that. And the main issue they pointed out with that was that it rests on a kind of assumption, because it's always, well, if I can't think of reasons for God to allow so much suffering in the world, then there probably isn't one. And they were challenged on that. It's like, on what basis do you think if God has reasons for something, that you're going to have access to those reasons, or you're going to know what those reasons are? And so you have to state that in your argument, that, okay, here's all the evil in the world. Here's what we mean by God. And I don't see any reasons for God to do this. And if God did have reasons, I would somehow be aware of them. People started challenging that little point. Like, what basis do you have for thinking that you would know what God's reasons are for having this evil and so on? So you ended up with philosophers who tried to reformulate the argument to avoid that little assumption. And what they came up with is it can have different names: a Humean argument, commonly called the Bayesian argument from evil. And it was a Bayesian form. So then there were all these articles going through the Bayesian argument from evil, but it was a limited number of articles because it was kind of new. And so I just kind of realized, wait a minute, I could study the Bayesian argument from evil, and I could actually read everything on that topic, read the classic works and the important articles on the problem of evil in general, but I can actually know everything that's ever been written on the Bayesian argument. So I did my dissertation on the Bayesian argument from evil. That was a long answer on how I got there, but that's how I got there. Hey, wait, is your audio not up while you're working on your camera? We can't hear you. Who are you talking to? All right, I'll take some questions while you're getting your audio up. Question, David Wood, you're a big-time Islamophobe. What is your greatest... Hey, for those who didn't see it, that was the question that Vladimir asked me. Question.
Well, Wood. Hopefully this is better.
Yeah, we hear you now.
Great.
Mm-hmm. So question, David Wood, you're a big-time Islamophobe. Although I hear an echo now.
I'll see what I can do about that.
So is the audio not going through your earphones?
No, I've had to change camera, and now it's just on my phone. Sorry. I'll see what I can do.
So David Wood, you're a big-time Islamophobe. What is your greatest argument for Christianity being truth while you claim Allah's word is a lie? Well, Jesus rose from the dead. That would be the main thing. There are all kinds of arguments for Christianity, but Jesus rising from the dead, that would be pretty big one. In other words, if I'm going to listen to anyone tell me about God and the afterlife and things like that, what's true, I'm going to go with the guy who rose from the dead.
Good call. Well, I want to ask a different question then. We'll pull this one down. The experience then of what's happened for you and Marie with your two sons. You've been really open along the way about two of your middle sons, Reed and Paley, being born with a very rare condition. And that's obviously led to them defying doctors' expectations on how long they would live. But obviously, not exactly the experience that you and Marie would have hoped for as parents for when the kind of news that you hear about your kids when they're born. They both have a really rare condition called myotubular myopathy. And I think you shared publicly that, it sort of gives a life expectancy of about a year. By the grace of God, Reed lived to be 16 years, I think, by when he died last year. How have you guys processed that together, you and Marie? I mean, you've spent time studying the problem of evil in a philosophical sense, but the experience of walking through that, I know you've got people that have asked you, how have you dealt with Nabil's death? How have you dealt with your own condition? How have you dealt with your two sons being born with this? Why does God allow these things to happen? And what have you found helpful wrestling with that from the Christian story?
Yeah. So my tubular myopathy, it's probably a better life expectancy than a year, but back then it was super rare because kids just didn't survive with it. In other words, if your kid was born with myotubular myopathy, he was going to die. So there were never like doctors working on it because it wasn't a big issue. It's not like cancer where you have tons of people around the world with cancer, and so you have this thing to work on. It's kids are born with this and then they die, and what exactly are you working on? And it's a super rare disease, so there's not a lot of emphasis to go into it for research purposes. But yeah, when Reed was born, and also, like, I didn't know how this worked. I had always assumed that if your kid is born and there's something wrong, they do a blood test and put the blood into a machine and it says, oh, your kid has this. Totally wrong. Not how it works at all. They say, here are the symptoms. Your child isn't moving. What are all the different things that can cause that? And so it could be a neurological problem. Your brain isn't working. It could be in the nerves between there, or it could be in the muscles themselves if the kid's not working. And they kind of just start working their way through. Okay, what's the most common brain problem that could lead to this? What's the most common muscle problem that can lead to this? And they start going down through there. But so it actually takes months. It takes months for them to figure out what's going on, and you have no clue. You don't know if this is something that your kid's going to snap out of. If it's something where as soon as they find out, they're going to give him a shot, and then he's going to get better. So you're sitting there waiting for months before they actually find out. And then, myotubular myopathy is one of the last things they check because it's so rare. Yeah, so then you find out, and then that's when they tell you that your kid's got a 50% chance of seeing his first birthday and about a 30% chance of seeing his second birthday. So anyway, my wife and I sort of sprang into action. Her mainly, like, at first we have to learn, because you have to learn to take care of a kid. You basically have to learn to be nurses at home, because you're taking care of a kid who needs attention all day, every day. And so we had to learn that. And then my wife became active in trying to help doctors who are doing the limited number of doctors who are actually researching the illness and so on. But yeah, it's really interesting stuff, because my wife had said back then that the only thing in the world she didn't think she could take would be, so she said this before we ever had, before Reed was born, she had said the only thing she didn't think she could ever take in life is one of her kids dying before her. And then, Reed died. So, Reed died last year, and she was, of course, crying a lot and so on, but she took it. And, you just realize that she had become a massively tougher person after having two of her kids all these years, and all the stuff that they've been through. I don't know. It just turned her into a total warrior. So, yeah, so it's, it makes you stronger people. If you're taking care of kids with special needs, they just over time, they make you they make it's like they make everyone around them better people. And
Mm.
so that's kind of the takeaway.
I love
We,
how
yeah.
beautiful you guys have shared that over time, just the gift that their condition has been towards everyone else and
Yeah.
how it helps you become more human.
Yeah, and it's not like I'm not saying like, oh, so I really want kids to have this and
Yeah.
make people around them better and so on. So it's not like that. I mean, you do anything to help your kid. But you know, given that they have that, that's just the impact they have. So they have very rough lives, but they
Mm.
make everyone around them better.
Mm. And is there something from your own experience, whether it's the study or just, you know, your or Marie's reading of the Christian story? What is the value of being a Christian when you're faced with this question? Because a lot of people might frame it, why would God allow you to be born with an antisocial personality disorder or for your sons to be born with this rare condition? But as you process the Christian story and the reality of a fallen world, this is not God's good design or God's end game. But is there something that's been really pivotal for either you or Marie in just finding hope?
Yeah. I mean, your perspective as a Christian would be significantly different from like if you were an atheist or something. I to this day I really have no idea why atheists would want to push this in certain situations because like okay, what's your alternative is that there's no point to anything and just too bad you just got some bad luck there. Whereas from the Christian perspective, it's hey God's in control and he didn't.
Mm.
We live in a fallen, sinful world, and he said we're gonna have problems. And this world, this is not heaven. You're not in heaven. You have real stuff that you're going to go through, and we're gonna have tribulations, and there's all sorts of stuff that we're going to go through.
Mm.
And so, yeah, it's so the difference is between believing in that there's a goodness behind all of this in no matter what happens, that there's that God is in charge and God is in control. And
Mm.
so it doesn't matter what you go through, you're fine. So there's that. And it's also this interesting thing where, I mean, if you go back, I mean, take someone like the Apostle Paul. I mean, that guy was, he received the 39 lashes 5 different times. He was beaten with rods 3 times. He was shipwrecked
Cafe.
multiple times, spent a night and a day in the ocean and so on. And said he was, hungry and all these different things, persecuted and eventually beheaded. It never crossed that guy's mind to say, hey, if there's a all powerful God that I believe in, why is he not helping me out here? And the reason they didn't back then, they weren't thinking of God as modern people think of him. Back then, they weren't thinking of God as this pleasure maximizing and pain minimizing being. If God exists, then the most important thing in the world is for him to keep us as far away from pain as possible and to give us as much pleasure as possible. They weren't thinking like that. That's a modern sort of hedonistic version of Christianity, where you think that God's goal is to minimize pain and maximize pleasure. That's never been the God of Christianity. And so lots of times when people are pointing out the problem of evil, it's because they've absorbed the idea that if God existed, he would be obsessed with maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. And yeah, if that's the sort of God you're talking about, yeah, the problem of evil would be a decisive refutation of that God. But that's never been the God that Christians have proclaimed. All right, your audio's off again. And just
How's that? Sorry.
And just so you know, if you're at all embarrassed, anyone who live streams has been through this thousands of times. We've all been through the technical problems over and over again.
It's crazy, isn't it?
It happens.
Just every time you set it up and all of a sudden, boom. But let's jump to your work with Islam, mate. And I really appreciate you just wandering through a lot of your own story. There's just so many fascinating and painful contours to that, but just to find how the hope of the gospel really does feed into that. And I've often just shared, there's a big part of my own story. A couple of weeks back, we had a couple of Oxford philosophers jump on to wander through 12 different theodicies. So there's a one up there called The Problem of Evil Explained, where we wander through just a major different responses. If that's a question that people are wrestling with, can go and check that out. But mate, you're obviously very well known for engaging Islam and for spending some pretty crazy antics as well as part of that. And so I want to dive into some different dimensions. But most Christians, and particularly those who are engaged in defending or commending Christianity in apologetics, would spend their time engaging secularism and atheism and unbelief and agnosticism and even apatheism in the West. But you've devoted a lot of your time to engaging Islam, which is a bit of an unknown force for many people in the West, and one they're just uncomfortable or uncertain about, and just trying to be a generous, hospitable citizen. What led you to want to focus on Islam particularly?
Well, I wasn't interested in Islam. It was so it's kind of started. I'd had a friend in prison. I mean, multiple Muslims that I knew in prison, but I had one friend that actually started reading a little bit, not a lot. I read Answering Islam in prison. That's by Norm Geisler and Abdul Salib, and then a little bit of the Quran there. That was the extent with my Muslim friend in prison. So later I'm out, and I was with Nabil, and with Nabil, then I actually start reading like hadiths and stuff, going through the Quran, going through the hadiths, because he was arguing in a, he had more persuasive arguments than, a guy in prison would have. He'd been raised to defend Islam and so on. So it actually made me study Islam. And then when Nabil became a Christian, I actually thought, cool, I'm done with Islam, because that was the only reason I was studying Islam, was that my best friend was a Muslim. But I realized along the lines of what you just said, after doing that, I was like, oh, okay, cool. Now I can get back to dealing with atheism stuff. And I just realized, like, wait a minute, everyone who does apologetics goes into atheism. And you've got Muslims who are like between a fifth and a quarter of the world's population, and no one's talking about it. And so it was just, hey, Muslims make really cool Christians. I'd seen that with Nabil. There's not a big emphasis on it. And so it was kind of, this is more what's needed. This is what's needed. Then this is what I wanted to do. So I wasn't interested in, I mean, you sit there and read about Muhammad all day. You just want to go take a shower and stuff. It's not something I would want to study if it weren't for some purpose. So yeah, I just ended up sticking with it, and here I am.
Now, there's, interesting videos of you online, and people might be familiar with some of the more extreme antics of eating a page of the Quran, or of making videos about the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, while atop the Dome of the Rock. You're there at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, just outdoors, and obviously very publicly criticizing. A lot of Muslims, that makes them angry. You probably are very familiar with that in the comment section, and positives and negatives throw back. How do you actually feel towards Muslims? Because I think a common perception, you've already brought it up a little bit earlier, is that to criticize and engage often means that they assume that you don't like them, or that you hate Muslims in general. What's actually motivating a lot of this for you?
Several things, and some of them actually learned from Nabil, and then later on found out it's more than just Nabil. So, I mean, I can tell you the exact moment. Nabil and I were watching the debate between, I think they had two debates. We were watching one of the debates between William Lane Craig and Jamal Badawi. And that was one of the most one-sided debates I've ever seen in my life. Craig absolutely crushed Badawi, and Badawi couldn't answer any of Craig's arguments. And so we're sitting there watching this, and we finish, and I go, hey, Nabil, what'd you think? And I would have scored this debate 95-5 if I were being generous. And so I said, oh, Nabil, what do you think? And he says, well, Badawi clearly won. And I was just like, there is this tendency for people to just side with their debater. Nabil's not like that. Nabil's very smart, and I'd seen him do it before. Before, where he said, oh, the Christian debater clearly won here, and so on. And so I was sitting there trying to figure out what he was seeing. What in the name of common sense did you just see that I didn't see? And I had to pry it out of him over time. What he was seeing was Craig, of course, totally calm throughout the debate. Badawi got so frustrated that by the end he's yelling. I don't know how things are in Australia and so on, but in America, if we see a debater get mad and start yelling, we're thinking you lost. You're losing. You're getting frustrated. That's why you're yelling. The Christian debater's calm because he knows he just destroyed you. He doesn't have anything to get upset about. So it took me a while to figure out, but Nabil was actually interpreting that as the Muslim guy is yelling and getting angry because this other guy is committing blasphemy. And he is the Muslim has this righteous anger that other people are being led astray, and that's welling up within him. The Christian debater is calm because deep down he doesn't even believe what he's saying. And so I thought that was Nabil back then, that he's looking at people and like, the more aggressive you are, the more right you are. And the more calm you are, the less right you are. And the less it's obvious you don't even believe what you're saying. And so I had to take that into account with him. Later on, I found out, no, that's very common in Islam, far more common than it is among Christians in the world. And so there's this extra dimension that they think it was built in more. They wouldn't say this now because now lots of people are blasting away at Islam. Back then they thought people won't go after Islam. They won't blast Muhammad on these issues because deep down they know Islam is true. And that's why they can't bring themselves to attack it or be aggressive towards it and so on. So I'm sitting here thinking Christians are obsessed with being nice and not hurting people's feelings. And the Muslim community is interpreting this as, see, deep down they know Islam is true and Christianity is false. I'm like, that is not the message you want them to take away. So it's kind of with Nabil that I start becoming more aggressive in my approach. And as the time goes on, I just realize it's just more effective. So in other words, Christians think that Muslims will pay attention less if you're really going after Muhammad and blasting away at the Quran. In reality, they take you more seriously. And even though they'll moan and wail and say, oh, look, he's being so insulting, he's being so mean, deep down, they actually have more respect. They have more respect for you than someone who's just nice to them and doesn't want to hurt their feelings and so on. So it's been a bunch of different things, but yeah, it's basically trial and error, and you find out over time what they actually listen to. And so I just keep doing more of that.
It blew my mind a little bit. I studied over in England for a year, and one of the guys I was studying with is a mate from Egypt, and he got into a big discussion with a Pakistani Muslim on the campus of York University. And we're outdoors, we're handing out flyers, lunchtime talks, and we just had drilled.
I can tell you that's going to go like this. They're going to both be wanting to,
Dude, it was unbelievable. And so, I mean, he grew up. Yusuf is an Arab, but grew up in an evangelical Christian family, which is a small percentage of Egypt, about 10% Copt, 90% Muslim. And what was fascinating about this interaction is we'd had drilled into us with gentleness and respect, and 1 Peter 3:15, and always let your conversation be full of grace, seasoned with salt, Colossians 4 verse 6, and they're just shouting at each other. And you can imagine 18, 19-year-old, very diminutive English students stopping to listen, but at a distance, because they both had backpacks and were shouting at each other. And the whole thing culminated with the Pakistani Muslim saying to my friend, "You are stupid. You should read the Quran and you become a Muslim." And Yusuf didn't even bat an eyelid. He said, "No, you are stupid. You read the Gospels and you become a Christian." And the guy hugs him and then says, "You're a good guy. We'll talk tomorrow."
Yeah.
And I just remember walking up to Yusuf and thinking, man, I have no idea what just happened. Can you please explain that to me? And he said, mate, unless you share with conviction, they think you don't believe what you believe, and therefore you don't care about them. And that was just an awakening moment, because a lot of Christians, when they may see your content, or I actually studied that year with Hatun Tash, another one of our common friends as well, who is very public in her debates over in Speaker's Corner over in the UK, and just is very, very critical of Islam. Has been stabbed at Speaker's Corner for the things that she said about Muhammad. It makes Christians uncomfortable, particularly Christians in the West, because they're not used to this form of engagement. So what do you say to people who might say it just doesn't at all feel Christ-like? The sort of satire, the cutting humor, the way that you criticize very overtly the prophet of Islam just doesn't feel Christ-like. How does that match the tone or the commands of the apostles to do this with gentleness and respect?
I would say I don't know what Christ you're talking about, because you see a pattern in the Bible. You'll have all these, you'll have these commands about gentleness and respect and so on. I mean, keep in mind, even the context of 1 Peter 3:15. One, he's talking about apologetics. Someone asks you a reason for the hope that you have. Well, guess what? You can ask me a reason for the hope you have. I'm not going to be mean at all. I'll tell you. I'll tell you exactly. But the pattern that you see, Old Testament and New Testament, there are certain kinds of people who are on the receiving end of just brutal rebuke, insults, and mockery even. And in the Bible, it's false prophets, false teachers, hypocritical religious leaders, and oppressors. Those are the people who, in the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, it's, hey, try to get along with people. As far as it depends on you, try and be at peace with all one. And then there's this category of people where it's, nope, gloves are off. You blast away at those people. And so you're talking about Christ-like. I mean, who did Jesus blast with the woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites? He calls them whitewashed tombs. He calls them brood of vipers, snakes. He mocks them. You strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. This is pretty brutal rebuke. Well, who are they? They're hypocritical religious leaders. And so the idea is there are certain kinds of people who are influencing other people, and other people are looking up to them. And it's like you're putting them in their place. And so there are certain kinds of people, again, Old Testament, New Testament, you just blast away at them. And again, it's hypocritical religious leaders, false teachers, false prophets, and oppressors. Those are the people who are on the receiving end of this. Well, if you look at Muhammad's like the paradigm example of all of those. He's a false prophet. He's a false teacher. He's an oppressor. He's a hypocritical religious leader. So it's like, for me, it's if anyone in history is a fair Christian target for open rebuke and mockery, it's him. And I know that there are times for that, because you see Jesus doing, you see the Apostle Paul do it with Elymas the sorcerer, who was leading astray other people. He's trying to hinder the gospel. And Paul blasts him and says, you son of the devil, you enemy of all righteousness, and so on. Very, very brutal in his rebuke. And so I look at that and I say, okay, there are people that you are supposed to go after to expose them in the sight of their followers. And so for me, it's Muhammad is the perfect example of someone that is that should be rebuked and even mocked.
In this kind of style that you use, we've got a question from Tezbot who said, hey, David, have friends turned their back on you because of your criticism of Islam? If so, was it worth it?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, there have been people I've worked with in the past who don't like the way I've gone about blasting away Islam. I have to say, though, it's way fewer people now have a problem with it. If you go back 15 years, I was like a demon to some people for blasting away at Muhammad. Fortunately, you don't see that much anymore. In other words, most of the feedback I got from Christians like 12, 13 years ago was, how could you do this? You're just going to lead people further away from Christ. They're never going to listen to you. And in fact, when I started posting, because Muslims would send me comments and stuff saying, hey, I just left Islam, so thank you. I was mad at you, but I kept watching your stuff, and so now I've left Islam. But I didn't, I don't normally like posting that stuff because it's like you're bragging. But I started posting it specifically in responses to people saying, David, this will never work. This will never work. You're just going to drive them further away. And I was like, oh. So I'd get that and I'd put it in a video and say, hey, you said this would never work. Here's 10 people from the last week who said they left Islam after watching my stuff. So how do you explain that? So I started posting it like that and just did that for years, posting these. And yeah, it's people over time, it's like people have caught on to, wait a minute, actually, it is very effective. It is very effective. Blasting away at Muhammad and the Quran. And there's reason for that. And actually, this goes back to Nabil as well. That he told me after he became a Christian, he said that when we were going through the evidence for Christianity, so he would have objections to the New Testament. We would start looking up like textual criticism of the New Testament and stuff. We'd start going through that. We'd look at the evidence for Jesus' death by crucifixion and so on. He told me after he became a Christian, he said, when I was a Muslim and we were looking at all this, I was thinking to myself, actually, these Christians, they have good evidence for what they believe. I thought there wasn't going to be evidence there, but they do have good evidence. They have good evidence that Jesus made these claims about himself. They have good evidence for the reliability of the New Testament. They have good evidence that Jesus died by crucifixion. They have good evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. But he said what kept him in Islam was, hey, but even if they were to show me with 99% certainty that all these things are true, I'm still 100% sure that Islam is true because of the amazing character of Muhammad, because of the scientific miracles, because of the perfect, miraculous preservation of the Quran. All that stuff is nonsense. But Muslims were raised to believe that sort of thing. And so you've got all these Christians who just say, oh no, we just preach we just need to go out and preach the gospel. We just go lovingly preach the gospel to Muslims. I was like, wait a minute, if this guy is 100% certain that what you're saying is completely false, and you think he's going to take you seriously, you've already got a problem.
Really helpful.
You've already got a problem. Whereas if you shake that confidence by exposing Muhammad, and what do you have to do there? You have to show, no, Muhammad did all these messed up things. And how are you saying that he's this perfect guy? You say you believe this about the Quran. That's actually false. I will show you. Then their confidence is shaken. So Nabil told me, it's like, it was after he was only able to take the gospel seriously after the claims of Islam were exposed before him. And so that's why you need both. You need apologetics and polemics. Very important dealing with Islam.
And how much are you motivated just by a concern of the spread of Islam as well? So you've obviously got a heart to be able to see Muslims fall away from Islam and to leave Muhammad and to embrace Christ and the gospel. But there's also, I think, a large, through mass migration, through population increase, a real entertainment of Islam in public spaces in ways that's probably surprising. I mean, even here in Australia, one of the things that brought this to the fore recently was the altercation with a Bishop Mari, who's an Orthodox priest down in Sydney, Australia, and he was attacked mid-service, mid-live stream, sort of knifed by a young man of Muslim conviction, and part of that they've traced, and the media is always very careful with this, not wanting to put too much down to motives, but was sort of his attacks upon Islam. And so I think Christians and Westerners, as two different groups, are sort of wondering, okay, there's differences here between Islam and Christianity. They're not the same. And there might be some embedded beliefs that are quite confrontational to things that within a Christianized society. And the West is not a Christian society, though much of its best features have been influenced, and the inheritance has been gained from the Judeo-Christian story. What do you kind of do with that concern, I guess, that there's just an increasing representation of Islam in the West? Is that part of what's motivating your desire to critique and expose Islam?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you look at Islam spreading, and you basically it's an issue of demographics, right? Muslims have the highest birth rates in the world, and so there was a Pew study years ago that said that Islam is the fastest growing religion. And Muslims just kind of ran with the headline, you see, this is because of all the powerful dawah and so many people converting to Islam. No, the study said why Islam was growing so rapidly. Muslims have the highest birth rates. And if you study why they have the highest birth rates, it has a lot to do with Islam's impact on women. It doesn't give them a lot to do in a lot of Muslim places. And therefore you're married off young, you have a bunch of kids and so on. And by the time a woman in the West is having her first child at age 26 or something like that, a 26-year-old Muslim woman in Afghanistan is on child number 8 or something like that. And so high birth rates. And so, Islam is growing rapidly due to high birth rates. And it's a different sort of thing in that you have Judaism and Christianity and so on. These are generally rules for, like, who are the rules of Christianity for? They're for Christians. If you don't like it, there's the door. There's the door over there. Whereas in Islam, it's no, these are the rules for Muslims. And we also have a set of rules for non-Muslims, that you guys have to be second-class citizens and to acknowledge your inferiority by paying tribute money to Muslims and so on. And it's built into the ideology to spread and conquer the world. So Islam is in a different category, and you need to be aware of it. I mean, Northern Africa used to be Christian. The Middle East used to be Christian. Islam swallowed these things up. I think it's like 80% of what was once Christendom was swallowed up by Islam. And so you got to be aware of that once a place goes full Islam, it's very hard to get out of it, because they're going to make laws against you leaving Islam. They're going to make laws against you preaching against Islam or criticizing Islam or preaching any alternative to Islam and so on. So it becomes very, very hard to get out of it. I mean, you look at Iran, what they're going through right now. Most of the population is non-Muslim now. So Iran is a Muslim minority country. They've done the studies. 40% of Iran right now is some version of Muslim. So it's a Muslim minority nation, and yet they still keep a brutal crackdown on the people there. So you have to look at that, and you look at even the impact that Islam has on Western nations. Even when it's like 8% or 9% of a population, they start making demands, and governments start caving to those demands. You see in Great Britain, they're throwing people in jail for criticizing Islam. And so you have to be aware of that stuff. And in other words, it kind of puts Islam into a different category. Like anything that's false, you would want to expose it for the sake of truth. But if it's false and it's coming to subjugate you and impose an ideology that you really don't like on you, it's in its own category.
Well, let's maybe step into exploring some of the ideas that either are argued for Islam or objections that are thrown against Christianity. This is where you spend a lot of your time at Apologetics Roadshow, is kind of wandering through some of these. And actually, I just wanted to share a couple of TikToks. So that'll be a nice way to maybe just bring up some of the popular Muslim apologists to see what are the critiques of Christianity and what are the arguments for. You've already mentioned this a little bit, but I thought it'd be worth playing. There's the common argument that Muslims will make is both around the miraculous revelation of the Quran to Muhammad, sort of in the 600s AD, starting in 609 AD. And this is now 6 centuries basically after the time of Jesus. But another one is that there are miraculous predictions within the Quran itself of things that will be discovered by science later. And so I want to play this and get your reaction to this whole line of argumentation.
String theory is a scientific theory that describes the smallest particles in the universe as vibrating strings. The theory states that the mass of a particle is determined by the frequency of vibration of the string. In the Quran chapter 4 verse 49 Allah says, "And they will not be wronged by a wick," 449, and verse 124 Allah says, "And will not be wronged by a pluck," 4-124. Allah speaks of the righteous people and mentions that their good deeds, no matter how small, will be evaluated. It is emphasized on how small by mentioning that the smallest particle is a wick or a thread-like structure. This is very similar to how strings are described in string theory. Furthermore, in verse 124, the Quran says that the smallest mass is a pluck, which means a single vibration of a string. This is exactly what string theory says about the relationship between the mass of a particle and the vibration of the string. Follow for more Islamic facts.
All right, so let me just give a little bit of background to that. So for those who are watching and are completely unfamiliar with Islam, Islam and Christianity really do part ways on the idea of God's revelation in history. That there is a God, we agree on what that God is like, who that God is. We have serious disagreements, and most of that's tracked down to how God has made himself known in history, how God has revealed himself to us as human beings. And obviously the Quran claims to be revelation from God in the same way that the Bible and the biblical authors certainly seem to make that same kind of claim. And so one of the arguments that's put in favor for the Quran of supporting its divine inspiration or divine origins is that it makes predictions that will be later discovered about our physical reality, about our universe, scientific predictions that have been vindicated and show this couldn't have been known just purely by human knowledge, has to be obviously come from God. And they use this example of string theory with plucking and strings and stuff in the Quran itself. What's your reaction?
Yeah, let me just read you. So Surah 4, verse 124, he pointed out. Let me just read that. I'll go ahead and read it to you in four Muslim translations here. "And whoso doeth good works, whether male or female, and he or she is a believer, such will enter paradise, and they will not be wronged the dint in a date stone." Okay, so far, so good. Yusuf Ali, "If any do deeds of righteousness, be they male or female, and have faith, they will enter heaven, and not the least injustice will be done to them." Hilali Khan, "And whoever does righteous good deeds, male or female, and is a true believer in the oneness of Allah, such will enter paradise, and not the least injustice, even to the size of a speck on the back of a date stone, will be done to them." Shakir, "And whoever does good deeds, whether male or female, and he or she is a believer, these shall enter the garden, and they shall not be dealt with a jot unjustly." So you have the various.
So this is like the idea that the translations don't match what was given, and so it's just stretching a metaphor or the verbal elasticity of that word.
Yeah. So this referred to a spot on a date stone, right? And so you can we had the same thing with the Bible. You either translate according to the meaning or you try to translate literally. And so if you translate literally, you're going to have some speck on a date stone or something like this. And if you go according to the meaning, if you say, well, not even a tiny little bit, right? You're not going to be wrong even a tiny little bit, because it's saying there's a little mark there. And so how in the name of common sense do you get to string theory from that? And the real takeaway here is, my goodness, look at the level of argumentation. Oh, it says, what's this actually saying? What's this actually? You're not going to be wrong even a tiny little bit. Okay, what's the tiny little bit? Well, as an example, hey, you see this little dent here on the date stone? Yeah. You see, not even that little tiny bit. Is he talking about the fundamental structure of reality and trying to make this scientific claim? Absolutely not. And by the way, that was the first argument that I was really given for Islam. This was in prison, and the guy sat me down and had me, my Muslim friend there, Anthony, he was a convert to Islam. He sat me down and showed me this hour or so long video of these scientific miracles in the Quran. It was the same thing over and over. They would say a bunch of scientific stuff and they say, and then there's the Quran. I'm sitting there looking at that verse and I'm going, where does it say any of that? Where does it say anything you just said? Where does it say anything that you just said? It doesn't. Fortunately, this argument is now no longer being used by the serious.
I've seen it even abandoned by some Muslim apologists and said, look, we can't use this anymore.
Yeah, and Hamza Tsortsis is the one who, he got embarrassed. He tried to use some of these scientific miracles arguments on an atheist scientist, and he just got humiliated in front of everyone. And then he went back and thought through it, and he actually came up with a good response on why they have to abandon this argument. He said that in order to show that there's a scientific miracle, you'd have to show, one, this is what the Quran is actually claiming. You're not inserting the meaning in there. It's something the Quran is actually saying. So that's the first criterion. So one, you have to show that the Quran is actually making this claim. Two, you have to show that the science is settled and this is going to be correct. I mean, guess what? String theory isn't even like confirmed as true, right? So he says you don't want to say that the Quran is predicting this scientific theory, and then the scientific theory turns out to be false, which would falsify the Quran. So you need to make sure the science is settled. And in addition to all that, it would have to be something that couldn't have been known at the time. And so right here, I mean, just off the bat, you would just look at this and say, is this talking about string theory, anything like that? No, this is not a confusing verse. There's nothing confusing about this verse. And so this would fail. This would completely fail requirements of actually making a scientific. There's nothing scientific there. There's nothing scientific being stated. So you're inserting that meaning into the text. And so fortunately, this argument is being abandoned, but there's another issue going on now that this is being shared on TikTok. YouTube, people are holding it. Christians and atheists who are responding to this stuff on YouTube are doing a pretty bang up job of refuting everything on YouTube. One of the trends in Dawah over the past several years is they no longer want to make these arguments to anyone who's familiar with the arguments and can expose them. So like just a few months ago, a bunch of us Christians showed up at Speaker's Corner. Muslims would not interact with us. The normal Dawah guys who love to preach to non-Muslims, they wouldn't come anywhere near us. And I've found out that that's actually the trend now. They only want to interact with people who aren't familiar with any of these things. And to me, that's like a sign that you understand you have a really weak argument. If your argument only works in an atmosphere of ignorance, how much confidence do you really have in the argument? And that's what's going on with TikTok. Is some of the lower level Dawah guys ran over to TikTok, and they understand it's a younger crowd and a crowd that is not familiar with these arguments and they don't know how to expose them. And therefore, hey, we have an atmosphere of ignorance over here on TikTok, so we can go use the same stupid arguments that have been completely destroyed over on YouTube, and we can use them and find people to fall for them. So you look at this and it's pathetic, man. Dawah is a joke at this point.
I think it's really healthy, though, then to test the strength of different arguments. And I mean, I would be guilty as a brand new Christian when I was 18, probably making arguments that I certainly would not stand by today. But as soon as you become aware of that fact, just saying, look, that was actually a bad argument. I think there are good arguments to believe, great arguments to believe, but that was a bad one. Let's move on, leave that behind. What, in your mind, is the strongest argument in favor of Islam being true? If you could switch hats for a second and say you had to be in a scenario where you have to make a case for Islam, what would you say is the best historical argument you'd put forward?
And it's weird because Dawa guys would agree with me on this, but I think it's so weak, but I can't think of anything stronger. It's just, hey, Islam is all about monotheism, and therefore this is the champion religion. And you see this from Dawa guys. They'll say, hey, why do you believe? They don't use the scientific miracles anymore. They don't use the perfect preservation anymore. So in recent years, I've been wondering, what are their arguments even anymore? All the arguments that they were using 10 years ago, they now reject. So what can they even argue now? Unfortunately, saw a recent video with Muhammad Hijab where he was asked this, and I was really interested because I had no clue what their argument would be at this point. And his first argument was, well, Muhammad promoted monotheism. It's like, well, that doesn't make you a prophet. And it's interesting because if I said, oh, well, if I right now say, hey, I am a prophet of pure monotheism, would you think I'm a prophet? No, of course not. Okay, why not? Well, because you'd contradict Muhammad. Okay, well, then the criterion isn't that you promote monotheism. It's something about Muhammad. So that's the problem. It's if you take sort of what they claim about Islam, that it is the religion, the champion religion of pure monotheism, then you'd say, okay, that's good. That's a sign that if you're in a pagan environment, a polytheistic environment, you're promoting pure monotheism. That's something there. But it's like, okay, well, that's monotheism. Islam is a package deal. You also have Muhammad, and you have to mindlessly agree with everything he says, no matter how absurd it seems to you. And so it's this package deal. Their Dawa arguments are really, really bad. I mean, the vast majority of them, you have to do the slightest bit of research, like 5 minutes of research, and you can see that it's completely bogus. And I want to be clear here. I'm not saying I disagree with the argument, and therefore I'm just going to say it's bad. The problem of evil, that's I reject the conclusion of the argument, but I understand the argument. I understand the force behind the argument. In Islam, if it's, hey, the Quran's been perfectly preserved, dot for dot, letter for letter. Okay, all you have to do, you could go in any direction. You could look at what the Muslim sources said about the preservation of the Quran. You could put manuscripts side by side and see all the differences. You can find different Qurans in different parts of the world. They actually have different Arabic Qurans in different parts of the world. There are tons of ways that show that it's completely false. That's what I'm talking about. It's not like, oh, I see your point, but I'm kind of not convinced. It's what you're saying is completely demonstrably false, 100%. That's how it usually is with their arguments. So I don't know of anything they have that's stronger than just we preach pure monotheism and your Trinity is confusing. I think that's a really, really weak argument, but I think it's the best they've got.
Yeah, on our channel here, we have like a 5 or 10 minute video just exploring, do Christians and Muslims worship the same God? And I think one of the points that I make in there is philosophically there's some shared scaffolding, which also means there's some shared arguments for God's existence. So the notion of cosmological arguments or contingency or ontology, or let's look at fine-tuning arguments, there Christians and Muslims will say, look, we think that there's good reason to believe that God exists, but the particular historical revelation of God to Muhammad with the revelation of the Quran is something that needs its own set of argumentation. Why accept this version? And I resonate with you. I think maybe the strongest thing I'm seeing put forward is maybe the simplicity and cultural strength arguments of, it's just much more simple. It matches human nature. We feel like we should do good and avoid bad, and you should pay for what you do, and you should have to earn your own way. That kind of fits some of the human nature that we experience of trying to do enough good things to outweigh our bad things. But also, I mean, you see people like Andrew Tate just arguing, look, when you go to an Islamic country, there's a fear of God. But when you go to countries that have become Christianized or Western countries, it just feels like God can be openly mocked in the streets and no one does anything. And so that projection of strength, which I think is appealing to a lot of lost young men at the moment, are probably the two strongest things that Islam has got going for it. I want to maybe ask then about the Islamic dilemma, because this seems to have become a lot more popular in recent times. And people that are unfamiliar, I might just shove it up on the screen at the moment. But the Islamic dilemma is basically, and I'll get you to give voice to this, the idea that in Surah 5, which for those uninitiated with the Quran is just chapter 5 of the Quran. Quran is 114 chapters. Each one of them is a surah, has a name or it has a number. And then the verse number is pretty similar to the way that a Bible would work. But it seems to be here that as you read the English translation below the Arabic original, that what is being affirmed in the time of Muhammad at the reception of this chapter of the Quran is the idea that Christians and Jews possess the Torah, which is the 5 books of Moses, the true revelation to Moses, and the Injil, which is the Arabic word for gospel or the message that Jesus himself preached. And this would mean that in the basically 7th century now, when Prophet Muhammad was receiving this revelation, the Christians and Muslims at that time had in their possession the true Torah and the Injil, and that this is something that's affirmed in the Quran itself. But a popular Islamic critique of Christianity is that the Injil and the Torah, all of the Jewish and Christian scriptures, have been corrupted over time so that they no longer say what was originally given. Obviously, this surah would confront that belief in the corruption irrevocably of the Torah and the gospel. It'd say, nope, the one that they had in the 7th century, that's the true one. And as a result, we literally have manuscripts of the Torah and the Gospels from then and before that period of time. So we can track through textual history, doing textual criticism, that this has not been irrevocably altered or politically changed or the Trinity inserted into it. What's your read on the Islamic dilemma and what's happening with its impact in the Muslim world?
It's the same thing that's been happening with the supposed perfect preservation of the Quran and with the scientific miracles and with Muhammad and Aisha and the character of Muhammad and so on. It's, you go back to the early 2000s and almost no one is dealing with Islam. I mean, you guys had Samuel Green down there in Australia. There was Jay Smith in the UK. There was Tony Costa up in Canada. There were a couple of us in the US, but not a lot of people were dealing with Islam. And so what you'd have is you'd have the Muslim Dawah guys. They would be making these claims. The Quran's been perfectly preserved. And you say, no, it hasn't. Other people are watching and they don't know. They have no idea what the history of the Quran is. They don't know what the Muslim sources say about the history of the Quran. They have no idea what any of this is. And all they have is a bunch of Muslims saying one thing and like a Christian saying something else. Well, you don't know who to believe. And you're thinking, oh, all the Muslims are saying this guy's lying. So I don't know. He may be lying. I don't know what to believe here. But the idea is they kept getting away with things. We just kept pushing. No, the Quran hasn't been perfectly preserved. No, that's not a scientific miracle. No, Muhammad did not have this great character. No, we're not lying about Muhammad and Aisha. And so it's just year after year after year after year. It's the same thing Gabe was saying earlier. It's just, I feel like I'm, smacking my head into a wall and over this stuff, but you just keep at it relentlessly. And yeah, you're not changing the entire Muslim community, but okay, that Muslim just realized it. Okay, that particular Muslim, after months of arguing with him, he actually understands now that that this scientific miracle is bogus and so on. So it just keeps happening. And eventually it reaches a kind of like tipping point, right? Where now all of a sudden the Dawah guys acknowledge that the scientific miracles argument was bogus. Now all of a sudden they no longer defend the perfect preservation of the Quran, and they admit that was bogus. Now they admit that Muhammad had sex with a 9-year-old girl. They start admitting all these things. So for years they say you're lying, and all of a sudden then they admit that you're telling the truth. Well, right now what's going on is they're still in the stage of saying we're making this up. But we're starting to reach a tipping point where they're people. It's becoming more commonly known. That's where things shift, because if only a few people know about something, they can say those few people are lying and they can shout them down. Once a bunch of people know about something, then you get to this tipping point. And right now it's becoming popular. So we've been defending the Islamic dilemma for many years, for since the early 2000s. But it was only a few of us using it. Now there are tons of people who are catching on. Now Muslims are making tons of responses to it. And at the end of the day, it's an airtight argument. It's as airtight as arguments get in the realm of criticizing a religion. It's basically Muhammad and the Quran affirmed the inspiration and the preservation and the divine authority, ongoing, current divine authority of the Jewish and Christian scriptures. Your average Muslim doesn't know this, just like your average Muslim 10 years ago thought the Quran was perfectly preserved, dot for dot, letter for letter, or that the average Muslim would think the Quran is filled with these scientific miracles. They believed false things because that's what they've been told by their religious leaders all their lives. And so your average Muslim thinks that what the Quran actually says is that the Jewish and Christian scriptures have been corrupted. You say, where does the Quran say that? They can't. It's just something they heard. They've never investigated it. And so for years, just like we were doing with Muhammad and Aisha, here's the source, here's the source, here's the source. Where's your source for saying the opposite? Where's your source? That's what we've been doing. Where the Quran says we have the inspired, preserved, authoritative word of God. Your average Muslim is only aware of two things about the gospel. So the Injil is the word for our scripture, the Christian scripture. He's only aware, one, that the Quran does say that Allah sent the gospel, and he's aware, two, that it's somehow given to Jesus, right? They're only aware of that. So they'll say, oh, you guys don't have the book given to Jesus, so therefore you don't have the Injil. They ignore all the verses you just read, 568, where it says we have it. That's what we're supposed to judge by. So the Quran over and over again affirms that we have the gospel, and that's what Christians are supposed to judge by. Your average Muslim thinks that all the earlier scriptures were corrupted. That's why Allah sent the Quran, so that now everyone would have to judge by the Quran. Total nonsense, according to the Quran itself. According to the Quran, Allah sent prophets and revelations into different parts of the world. The Arabs were the last. The Arabs were just last in line. He got to everyone else first, and then the last people were Arabs, so he sent Muhammad to give a revelation in Arabic that the Arabs could understand. And at that point, it was everyone has their own book in their own language. You have to judge by your own book, which is why earlier in Surah 5, a group of Jews come to Muhammad. This is Surah 5, verse 43. Anyone can read it. Surah 5, verse 43, a group of Jews come to Muhammad because he's a political leader at that time. And they say, hey, we're having this dispute. What do you say? And Allah says to Muhammad, why are they coming to you when they have the Torah? In other words, they're Jews. You're supposed to be judging by the Torah. A few verses later, Surah 5, verse 47, it says, let the people of the gospel judge by what Allah has revealed therein. So you get this, the real takeaway message from the Quran is you all have your revelations from God. You judge by the revelation in your language. And what happened historically is eventually Muslims started realizing, because keep in mind, I mean, the early Muslims were a bunch of polytheists, right? They don't know what's in the Torah. They don't know what's in the Bible. I mean, they don't know what's in the gospel. Muhammad's saying these scriptures all line up with him, and they believed him. Eventually, as time goes on, Muslims start finding out that the Torah and the gospel do not line up with the Quran. But by that point, you can't say that. You can't say it. You can't say it. You get your head chopped off for saying, hey, the Quran's wrong here. Muhammad was wrong. You get your head chopped off. So what did they have to do? They started saying, oh, their scriptures have been corrupted. It's the only thing you can say at that point. Because think about the alternative that you're left with. If the Quran affirms the inspiration and the preservation and the authority of the Jewish and Christian scriptures, there are only two possibilities. And either way, Islam is false. So either we have the inspired, preserved, authoritative word of God, or we don't. If we have the inspired, preserved, authoritative word of God, Islam is false because Islam contradicts what we have on basic doctrines. So if we have the word of God, Islam is false. If we don't have, that's the only other possibility, if we don't have the inspired, preserved, authoritative word of God, Islam is false because Islam affirms the inspiration, the preservation, and the authority of our scriptures. So if we have the word of God, Islam is false. If we don't have the word of God, Islam is false. Either way, Islam is false. That's a problem. And so to avoid that problem, you just have to pretend that the Quran does not say these things about the Torah and the gospel. And that's worked really well for Muslims over the centuries because they're dealing with an atmosphere of ignorance. Non-Muslims weren't reading the Quran. Most Muslims weren't reading the Quran. They have passages that they recite as part of their prayers and so on, but they don't know these things. They don't know these things about the Quran. And so we're in this awesome position now where now Muslims are catching on. And now that they're catching on, we're gonna dial up. We're gonna dial up this argument. So I'm actually I'm putting together a group where we're actually over a period of several months, we're going to go through every single verse in the Quran, find every single thing the Quran says about the previous scriptures. Every verse that a few Muslims use to try and twist to say, oh, this verse is saying the gospel's been corrupted or something like that. We're going to go through everyone. We're going to go through every single verse. We're going to put it all together into a document and then put it out there. Hey, guys, here's everything the Quran says about the previous scriptures. Show us where this isn't saying what it's obviously saying. So these are good times, but you're going to see a tipping point. You're going to see another tipping point here where people catch on.
And do you think that's already happening somewhat because of the digital influence of YouTube and TikTok, where you're seeing larger numbers of Muslims exposed to the online space actually falling away from Islam, but somewhat maybe in private?
Oh, yeah, we know this. We know this. They call it the avalanche of apostasy. So that's their term. They call it an avalanche of apostasy. And people, I keep telling like young people and so on who are getting involved in this, you have no idea how much better it is now than it was 20 years ago. 20 years ago, if you started criticizing a Muslim claim, you got blasted by everyone. Muslims blasted you. They're calling you an Islamophobe and a bigot and saying you're a racist for criticizing Muhammad. Atheists would blast you for a completely different reason. They would say, hey, you're a Christian, you're attacking a religious claim, but you also have religious claims, and all religious claims are equally dumb. And so you get blasted by atheists. And then Christians would say, oh, but you're being so mean. You're just supposed to lovingly preach the gospel and never supposed to criticize, because criticizing hurts people's feelings. And that is the cardinal sin of modern Western Christianity, hurting people's feelings. So you just got blasted by everyone and called a liar by all kinds of people and so on. Whereas now things are catching on. But back then, someone being a public apostate from Islam was so rare that it was still common for Muslims to claim no one ever leaves Islam. Now that's insane to anyone who even knows the history of Islam, because I mean, Abu Bakr, the first of the rightly guided caliphs, he had to fight what were called the apostate wars. So many people were leaving Islam, he had to fight wars against them. And somehow you got down to the modern period and people are thinking that no one ever leaves Islam. But when Nabil left Islam and became a Christian, it would be, oh, he's actually he was always a Christian. He's just been paid to pretend that he was a Muslim. You heard that all the time. Now there are so many people who've left Islam. They can't defend that anymore, but they call it the avalanche of apostasy. But the statistic as of like six or 7 years ago or something like that was that 24% of young Muslims are leaving Islam. So you're talking a quarter. It was estimated that between 5 and 10% of Muslims in Muslim nations are actually closet atheists who can't share it. You had Asadullah Ali, who he posted a video and then he tried to take it down real quick. But it was him, and he's speaking to a Muslim group, and he says he's met hundreds of, just as he's going around speaking and so on, he's met hundreds of young people who are in mosques. They're going to Islamic schools and stuff, but they're confiding in him. I don't actually believe in this stuff, and I don't know what to do. I don't actually believe any of this stuff. I'm going with it because I don't want to upset my family. So he said hundreds, and that's just a guy. These are people telling him, I'm actually an apostate. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to deal with this. And that's just him saying hundreds and so on. And then again, you got Iran, 40% Muslim population now. That's combined, Sunni, Shia, everything, about 40%. So Islam is actually crumbling from within. And this ties into what I was saying earlier about when you're talking to a Muslim and he seems to be becoming more devout and more confident, even though something's eating him up inside and he's having all these doubts, but he compensates by becoming more aggressive.
Yeah.
So it looks like it, because that's happening in the entire community. The entire community they know they're dealing with this avalanche of apostasy. They know that people are leaving Islam in droves. And so their reaction is to become more confident. And so it's looking like, wow, these guys are really aggressive and they're really, the Muslim community is really strong at the way they're coming at us. No, this is an act of desperation. And the plus side here is there's no plan B after this, right? This is like, oh my goodness, 24% of young Muslims are leaving Islam. If you go back 20 years, it was close to 0%. You went from like close to 0% to 24% in a very short period of time. What's it going to be like 10 years from now? It's we have to do something right now or we will never recover. Those are their words. If we do not do something right now, the Muslim community will never recover. So they're dialing up their aggression, trying to throw Islam in everyone's face, looking for any last little patch of ignorance they can find to preach, to use these same ridiculous dawah arguments that they know are bogus, but they still are looking for people to use them on. That's the situation they're in right now. So good. Again, the takeaway is if this fails, there's no plan B. What do they have after this?
So we've looked at maybe a few of the reasons why you don't think that Islam is true, and maybe just a lot more to say in that area. Obviously, go and check out videos on Apologetics Roadshow and ton of live streams that David does, because there's a lot around the history of Muhammad's life and the reliability of the different hadiths that come, and just the history of early formation, the Quran, and a ton there to wrestle with. But there are some in the conversation between Muslims and Christians, common criticisms that Muslims throw at Christianity. And so they've got their own critiques of the Christian revelation. And they're often ones that Christians are entirely unprepared for, because Christians spend most of their time talking with atheists or apatheists who just don't really care much about the religious stuff. But probably the most cited three would be the idea of the Trinity and the incarnation and the atonement. So I thought it might be worth just looking at a few of these videos and just respond to a couple more TikToks that are put forward by these, just to get maybe what you would say in 2 to 3 minutes in response to this in a conversation when it does come up. So we might do one more of these, and here we go.
My name does not even exist in the Bible. But guess what? It's in the Quran. Chapter 4, 171. It says, so believe in Allah and his messengers and do not say Trinity. Stop.
Oh, that's a lie, by the way.
Good. Allah is only one God. Let's debunk the Trinity. First off, what's the first commandment in the Bible? It's to believe in the oneness of God. So that's already breaking the first commandment. Secondly, let's define Trinity. There are 3 persons. Each person is God. Each person is unique, but there's only one God. Most Christians can't be logical with this, unfortunately. How can 3 be separate but be one as a whole? The brain just goes into a meltdown trying to make sense. Imagine trying to worship this Trinity. What image would be in your head? God, the Son, or the Spirit? No human can think of one image when worshiping this Trinity. It's not possible. The verse which comes closest to the Trinity in the Bible was actually thrown out by the highly renowned scholars of Christianity as a fabrication. Let me know your thoughts on this.
All right, well, there's the invitation. Let me know your thoughts on this.
Lots of thoughts, and that was one of the stupidest things I've ever seen, but it's the sort of thing that's popular among young Muslims. I mean, even look at what he just said. No one can think of any image of this. Or do you Muslims think you can get an image, like a mental image of your God, and that if you can't, that's a problem. So you've got some issues. So bunch of quick problems with this. One, saying that the Bible doesn't use the word Trinity. That's right. The Bible doesn't use the word theology either. That's like saying there's no theology in the Bible, because
or omniscient or omnipotent or any of those big words that we use to describe God.
Yeah, it's the concept that's the concept that's there. Later on, Christians have to come up with a name for the concept. So if you said there's the concept in the Bible that there's one God and that there are 3 persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, who are all God, and yet there's one God, that's definitely in the Bible. That is indisputably in the Bible. And so you just come up with a name for the concept. Then they said in Surah 4, verse 171, it uses the word Trinity. No, that's what a translator did to make it sound like it's talking, like it's the Trinity. It just says, say not 3. Don't say 3. And there are claims that it's actually responding to tritheism there. But the point is, Allah never, in fact, if you go to the Quran doesn't even have an accurate understanding of what the doctrine of the Trinity is. Allah seems to think that the Trinity is Allah, Jesus, and Mary, who are separate beings who work together as like a little holy family. That's what the Quran is responding to when it says, say not 3. So as a Christian, you could say, amen. I reject that. I reject that tritheism claim. So you have that. Then there was this claim that it's incoherent because it's 3, but it's 1. Guys, there are all kinds of things like that. There are all kinds of things that are 1 in one way, more than one in another way. And if I were talking to a Muslim, I would use Allah as an example. Allah has 99 names in Islam that correspond to 99 attributes. Those attributes are, according to Islam, different things. So Allah's mercy is not the same as his wrath. In fact, there's a hadith where Muhammad says that that Allah's mercy triumphs over his wrath. So wait a minute, you've got Allah's mercy is not the same thing as his wrath, and they're actually in conflict, and one triumphs over. That means these are not the same thing. Allah's mercy is not the same thing as his wrath. No Muslim would ever say, well, therefore, there's multiple gods there. No, you're saying God is one. Allah is one in essence or nature of being. He's more than one on the level of attribute. So the point is, Muslims understand how God can be one in one way, more than one in another way. And you can even use some examples. So I mentioned that there are different Qurans in different parts of the world. These are called the Qira'at. So there's different versions of the Quran, and lots of Muslims think that these all go back to Muhammad, that it was revealed, the Quran was revealed in all these different ways. And so they believe that there's only one Quran, and yet the Quran, if you're talking about the ahruf, it's the different modes of the Quran, the different modes of the Quran. Now, wait a minute. So there's one Quran, but it's revealed in 7 different ways, according to Muhammad. It's revealed in 7 different modes, but it's one Quran. So it's different. You can line them up. They're different, but they're somehow all one Quran. Okay, don't come at me and tell me, that you have a problem, with the doctrine of the Trinity when you're saying, hey, these 7 different ahruf are all one Quran, or these 10 different qira'at are all somehow one Quran. In addition, you can go even deeper than that. You have Allah, and you have Allah's speech, which is one of Allah's attributes. That's one of his attributes, is his speech, which is eternal. That's his eternal speech. That's the Quran. According to Muhammad, the Quran will appear at the judgment in the form of a man, and will tell people, will intercede for people on behalf of people based on how they've read the Quran and so on.
So the Quran will become flesh and dwell among them.
Yeah. So, I mean, at least appears. And by the way, you have the same thing in the Quran about Allah's spirit. So Allah breathes out his spirit, but his spirit appears to Mary in the form of a man. So the spirit appears in the form of Allah's spirit that he breathes out from all eternity appears in the form of a man. Allah's speech that he speaks out from all eternity appears in the form of a pale man. But you also have Muhammad saying that individual chapters of the Quran, individual surahs, surah 2, surah 3, and so on, will appear as flocks of birds to intercede. So surah 2 will appear as a flock of birds and will intercede for people, saying, yes, so-and-so recited me every so often and will actually defend you. Well, what's that mean? So you have chapter 2 appears as one, and the implication doesn't say this, but the implication is that it's a flock of birds because the individual birds are like individual verses, right? But it doesn't actually say what it means to be a flock of birds. But anyway, it appears as a flock of birds that intercedes for you. Okay, so guess what? That's some sort of agent. That's a person. It's interceding. It's speaking. It's arguing on your behalf, and so on. But you have Surah 2 does that. Surah 3 appears as a flock of birds. Surah 4 appears as a flock of birds. So you have all these different personal agents, chapters of the Quran appearing as personal agents, and yet the Quran appears as one man. So wait a minute, you have one man with all these different persons within that one man, and this is an attribute of Allah that he speaks out, and Allah's speech is going to be interceding with Allah. So it's Allah's speech that's speaking back to him. And so anyway, the point here is, if Muslims want to object to the doctrine of the Trinity, the only legitimate, consistent basis that they can have for arguing against the Trinity is to say that it's not actually
in
revealed.
The Bible.
It's not actually revealed in Scripture. You can't say it's confusing. If you're going to rule it out, you say, I can't get my mind around this. Okay, look at what you believe about Allah and Allah's spirit appearing as a man and Allah's speech appearing as a man. And within the speech of Allah that appears as a man, there's 114 persons within this one. Okay, don't bring that objection with me.
Yeah. Yeah, we've got a video on the channel. If you're wondering what is the Trinity and how does the Bible teach it and can you make sense of it logically, there's just a short 5 to 10 minute video on what is the Trinity. You can go and check that out as well for more of a positive case for it. Let's jump to the next one, which is the idea that the second member of the Trinity, or God, the eternal Son, can take on humanity. And I've often heard this sort of framed as how on earth can the infinite become finite? So we'll check this one out.
Human and fully God.
Really?
Yes.
At the same time?
Yes.
Right.
That is the Christian doctrine.
Okay. Does Jesus have a God?
No. He is God.
So how does he have a God?
A father meant
He doesn't.
God.
He says, I go now to my God.
Yes, because he was
My
fully
father.
human and fully God.
So he has a God.
In his human form, he has a God. In his fully human nature, he has a God. In his divine nature, no, he is God.
He has a God. Why do you think Jesus was divine?
Because he claims to be.
Where?
In all of the Gospels.
Give me an example. Give me one example.
When he calls himself the Son of Man, clearly referring to the prophecy in Daniel 7, where the Son of Man is a divine figure flying on the clouds, as only Yahweh was said to fly.
Read your book in Hebrews. I think it's the Hebrews or Revelation. Something that says the Son of Man is equal to a maggot.
Yes, but different words, different phrases can be used in different forms. It's generally agreed that when Jesus uses the Son of Man, he is referring to the prophecy in Daniel 7.
Why do you think that?
Because it's clear from the way Jesus uses it. He refers to himself as being in the same sense.
All right, so this is Hamza, another very well-known online digital personality, particularly on TikTok and elsewhere, getting into it with
another professional marathon runner. Look what happens whenever anyone challenges him to a debate. Watch. So look, he was happy to have a conversation with her. If that proceeds, he will eventually run, even from a random woman at Speaker's Corner. He won't do it. Good.
Yep. But the major implication here is there's something wrong with the Christian idea that somehow God can take on humanity, that God could become human in the incarnation. How do you respond to that critique that Muslims often bring?
Once again, multiple ways. So one, it's an ongoing issue that Muslims are not even aware of what their own books say, and how if they were to take their own criticism seriously, it would cause all kinds of problems for them. So even when I was answering the other question, talking about what their theology actually is, that Allah has his speech, he has his spirit takes on the form of a man, his speech takes on the form of a man. And they had these claims in their books on Tawheed that the Allah's speech is neither Allah nor is it other than Allah. The Quran is neither Allah nor is it other than Allah. So very confusing things. So anyway, it's important for them to understand those kinds of things. But they had these issues of so one, they'll have an issue with God entering into creation. So the very act of the incarnation, not realizing that they have this gets brought up a lot now, but there are hadiths where Allah has to enter into creation and descend through the heavens to get to the lowest heaven. That's where we are, to hear people's prayers. And so, wait a minute, Allah can't hear people's prayers from where he is on the throne. He has to get really close to human beings in order to hear them. And so here you have Allah entering into our world in order to hear what people are saying to Allah. So there you have the idea of Allah entering into creation to move around and accomplish something. In addition to that, even in the Quran, Surah 27, 7 through 9, Allah entered into the fire. It's talking about the burning bush. And you have Moses says, hey, something's going on with the fire. He goes there, and then the voice comes out of the bush and says, oh, Moses, I am Allah. So it's Allah speaking out of the fire. Now think about that. This is, the voice says, blessed is he who is in the fire and those who are around the fire. So he who is in the fire. Who's in the fire? Well, the voice says, I am Allah. So Allah can enter into creation and enter into a fire and then speak out of the fire. Okay, if Allah can enter into creation and enter into a fire,
that's awesome.
why could he not enter into human nature or something like that? He can enter into a fire, but not into human nature. That explain that to us. So those are the kinds of issues you'd point out if you're trying to get your Muslim friend to understand, wait a minute, if you be careful when you're saying God can't do this, because if you're saying God can't enter into creation, what do you do with Allah entering creation to hear people's prayers? What do you do with Allah entering into a fire? What do you do with those kinds of things? So you'd bring those up. And as far as because you do actually want to show that the Christian position is coherent, you just have to say, okay, wait a minute. You're saying you can't get your mind around the Trinity. I've already showed you that if you're just going to say it's confusing, therefore it can't be true. Well, great. Now I have to throw out Islam because your theology, if you actually say what it is massively confusing. But just grant for argument's sake that God is a Trinity. Suppose that he has revealed that he is a Trinity. And so that God is three persons and one God in nature, and one of the persons of the Trinity enters creation as Jesus of Nazareth. So this would be, as to his divine nature, he would have been someone who, for all eternity, has been in a loving relationship with his Father. If the second person of the Trinity were to enter into creation, would he then be an atheist? Is he supposed to be an atheist, or would he continue the communion that he's had for all eternity with the Father? And if so, how would that happen? If he has entered into creation as an actual human being, how would he continue the relationship he's had from all eternity with the Father? Well, that would be through prayer and so on. So why do you guys have a problem with this? So in other words, you can't say, it's another situation where you can't say, oh, it's confusing, therefore it's not true. I can point out a million.
You've already got complexity in the Quran itself when it speaks about these things. So there's just parallels that you can point to.
Yeah, so you can't say it's confusing or it's too complicated or I can't get my mind around it. There are all kinds of things in Islam like that. So at the end of the day, you'd have to say it's not true. Okay, show me why it's not true. It's not because you can't get your mind around it. That's not the criterion here. You have to show that has not been revealed by God. If you want to show that God hasn't revealed that he's a Trinity, or that the second person of the Trinity entered creation as Jesus of Nazareth, show us that. But don't just say, oh, I don't get this. This makes no sense. I'm confused here.
And maybe the way that they most frame it then is they'll point to passages within the Gospels where it seems like Jesus says he either lacks power or he submits to the Father or he doesn't know something. And they would say, well, surely Jesus should be able to heal whether people believe or not because he's omnipotent, or if he's equal with God, why is he showing submission to or calling his Father God? Or if he is omniscient, why doesn't he know the day or the hour of his return? What do you do with those sorts of troubled passages?
Yeah, and you can of course give responses to individual passages, and there might be a lot to go into as far as like a specific passage and so on. But the overall gist, as far as, wait a minute, these passages where Jesus is sounding like a man, yeah, we get that. That's part of the doctrine of the incarnation. We're well aware of that and so on. Yeah, but I mean, just imagine this situation. So again, it's like they'll raise the objection, and then, as they're raising the objection, they'll assume that we're Unitarians, not Trinitarians, and they'll ignore the incarnation. And then they'll say, well, this isn't something God could say. Well, no, that's something, if the second person of the Trinity became incarnate as a man, would he say that? Yes, he would say that. So the idea is you have passages in the Bible about the eternal divine nature of Jesus. So John 1, Philippians 2, and so on. This is talking about, prior to the incarnation, right? You have these passages, and then you have the incarnation. So if you were to put, I should make some sort of graphic about this, but you can imagine from eternity past, going back to eternity past, here's Jesus, and then enters into creation. And then as he's in creation in the form of a man, Philippians 2 says, takes on the form of a man, then he says all these things. And there he's speaking to the Father. And he's saying all these things about him being a man and so on. When's he saying those things? In his
when he's a man,
in his incarnate state. Yeah. He's supposed to say those things, right? So it's the objections only work if you ignore the doctrine of the Trinity and ignore the incarnation. If you say, okay, assuming that the Trinity is true and the incarnation is true, do those statements then make sense in that context? Yes, they do make sense in that context. And so that's why they have to act like we're not Trinitarians. In other words, as soon as you break down the Trinity and the incarnation, then immediately you'll get, well, who's Jesus praying to?
Yeah.
Is he praying to himself? Is he praying to himself? Why would he pray to him?
Yeah.
So again,
So sometimes it's just them getting a proper understanding of what these things are, and you can understand some people having misinformation or a degree of ignorance, and a big part then of, I think, arguing in good faith is make sure you really understand where someone's coming from. So if they have a different position to you, think through it, try and connect with the best versions of another argument, and then form your criticisms based off that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
yeah.
And
We've got a video. Sorry, you go.
Oh, I just want to say, and it helps to be aware of some of the things in Islam. Keep in mind, you could blast away at Islam. That does not make Christianity true. But in order for them to see, wait a minute, maybe I need to think through my objection a little more. I mean, just think about Allah speaks out his word. So it's one of his attributes. He speaks it out. Yeah. But then what he speaks out takes on the form of a man and then speaks back to him. It's interceding with him. So what is that? That's Allah's speech speaking back to himself as a person. So it's a person. There's Allah, the person, and then his speech is another person speaking back to him. So is he speaking to himself? You could raise the exact same kinds of objections with Islam.
Yeah, those parallels are really helpful. We've got a video too on that. How can Jesus be both human and divine? If you want to check that out, it will go through a number of different models of the incarnation just to try and wrestle with the logic and the thinking and then those trouble texts. Hopefully that'll be useful to you as well. David, at the heart of, I guess, the Christian story, that was the cross and of God dealing with human sin through Jesus' atonement. And this is another one where Muslims have key concerns. We're about to play a video in a moment. Just for everyone else, we're drawing towards the end of this live stream. And so if you've got a couple of questions you'd love to throw for David into the chat, just put question, all capitalized, and then what comes after it. Huge thanks to those who have been sending in some supers just to support the channel. It's super kind of you. We're really, really thankful for that. But we'll do a little bit of Q&A just to wrap this up. But I want to play one more video. This is on debunking the atonement and get your response to it, David.
Jesus sacrificed himself and died for the sins of mankind. Why is this belief wrong?
This belief is wrong on many different grounds. On a very basic logical grounds. If you think about the Christian belief, they're effectively telling us you are born into sin, original sin, because Adam ate from the tree. And then that sin is removed away from you because Jesus died on the cross. So effectively, you're given sin and it's removed from you. All you have to do is believe in this story. Now that seems to me to be an affront to individual responsibility. Because the religion of Islam doesn't have it this way. It has it in the way that you are responsible for your own actions. What the religion of Christianity is telling you is you have a sin for no action of your own, and you have that sin removed for no action of your own. So we will say this doesn't make sense. And how could it be that a God anyway dies on the cross? This makes no sense. What does it mean for a God to die on the cross? All these propositions, no matter how much one wants to say they're historical and they're attested to and there's testimony and whatever the argument on the other side is, frankly, even if that was all the case, it's still logically incoherent, so it's unacceptable, frankly.
What are your thoughts?
Notice what I just said before. They have to ignore the Trinity and the incarnation. What does he do right there? Now, how can God die? It doesn't make any sense. Well, if God entered creation, as the form of a man, could that man die on the cross? Here, there's a couple different things here. So here I give the example of the Quran. So the Quran is Allah's eternal speech, right? The Quran is Allah's eternal speech. It has no beginning. It has no end. It was not created. It cannot be destroyed. Allah's eternal speech. But wait a minute. Do you mean this? This isn't created? It's got a publication date right there. Oxford University Press, 1996. What? This doesn't have a beginning? This definitely has a beginning. This is made of paper and glue and ink. This will eventually fall apart. What do you mean? This is eternal. It can't be corrupted. What are you talking about? This has a beginning. It will have an end. It can be destroyed. People, you can burn this thing right now. What do you mean the Quran is the incorruptible, eternal speech of Allah? Their actual theology is that Allah's eternal speech, if it enters our physical world, gets put into a physical book. And so the eternal speech of Allah makes no sense to say that it has a beginning or that it can be changed or that it can be corrupted. But if it enters our world in the form of a book, then it has two natures. It is the eternal speech of Allah, but it also has a physical nature. And because it has taken on a physical nature to be in our physical world, then it can have a beginning, then it can be destroyed. So just think about that. The exact same thing. What sense does it make for God to die? Well, yeah, you need the incarnation. What sense does it make for Allah's eternal speech to be burned? It makes no sense unless it takes on a physical nature of a book. Then it makes perfect sense. So the fact that you have like the champions of Dawah who will at least act like they don't get this, even though if we took that objection seriously, we'd have to say, okay, this isn't the speech of Allah then. This isn't, because this can be burned, and Allah's speech cannot be. It's not the sort of thing that can be burned, right? God is not the sort of thing that can die. God's speech is not the sort of thing that can be burned or destroyed. So it's the exact same objection where if they wanted to respond to it, they'd have to say, well, if the speech takes on a physical nature, then the physical nature, yeah, it can. Okay, well, great. Then apply the same thing to Christianity, but you don't, because that's called inconsistency and hypocrisy. So you have those kinds of issues. But then the other issue is him like saying it's unjust, right? The idea that it's somehow unjust and it takes away responsibility and so on. And here's a situation where I don't know. That's his job. He knows he's being deceptive. That guy. I'm not saying an average Muslim who says this. Your average Muslim who says, "Oh, it makes no sense for someone to pay for the sins of others or for God to atone for sins in that way. That makes no sense. That's evil." If it's an average Muslim, I would think, okay, he doesn't know what his own sources say. I would think that's what he's saying. Hijab knows what his sources say, and he says it anyway, which means that's just sheer deception. But I'll just give a couple of quick examples here. These are passages from the hadiths. And so these are quotations from Muhammad. Sahih Muslim 7011. This is the Darussalam edition. So if they look it up online, it'll be a different numbering system. But Sahih Muslim 7011, it was narrated that Abu Musa said, the Messenger of Allah said, when the day of resurrection comes, Allah, glorified and exalted is He, will give every Muslim, a Jew or a Christian, and He will say, this is your ransom from the hellfire. So think about that. Jesus said that the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give His life as a ransom for many. People, oh, ransom. What does Allah say? He will give every Muslim, a Jew or a Christian, and will say, this is your ransom from the hellfire. Somehow Christians and Jews are going to ransom Muslims from hellfire. Sahih Muslim 7012. The Prophet said, no Muslim man dies, but Allah causes a Jew or a Christian to enter the fire in his stead. Sahih Muslim 7014. The Prophet said, on the day of resurrection, some Muslim people will come with sins like mountains, but Allah will forgive them and will place the sins on the Jews and the Christians. So Muslims will have sins like mountains, and Allah will take the mountain of sins and will put the mountain of sins on the Jews and the Christians. And then 110 Ahadith Qudsi, number 8, last one I'll read. Allah's messenger said, on the day of resurrection, my ummah, nation, will be gathered into 3 groups. One sort will enter paradise without rendering an account of their deeds. Another sort will be reckoned an easy account and admitted into paradise. Yet another sort, so Muslims, yet another sort will come bearing on their backs heaps of sins like great mountains. Allah will ask the angels, though He knows best about them, who are these people? So these people with sins like great mountains. They will reply, they're humble slaves of yours. He will say, unload the sins from them and put the same over the Jews and Christians. Then let the humble slaves get into paradise by virtue of my mercy. So Hijab was just complaining that Jesus dying for your sins rules out personal accountability. And yet his own prophet says that Allah will punish Jews and Christians in hell for the mountains of sins of Muslims. So you're a Muslim, you've done all sorts of messed up things, no problem. Allah will take your sins off of you, put them on Jews and Christians, and the Jews and Christians will pay for those sins in hell. What is that? That is substitutionary atonement. And so as a Christian, again, you would have to defend it. You'd have to defend the Christian view, and you'd do that pretty straightforwardly by saying, wait, if God is perfect in His justice, if God's justice is perfect, that demands all sin be punished. If God's love and mercy are perfect, He's going to want to forgive and let you off the hook. So His attributes are actually calling for different things. When God's justice is calling for punishment and His love and mercy are calling for forgiveness, what does God do with a human sinner? He could let the sinner go, and that would be very nice and loving, but it wouldn't be just. Or he could punish the person, that would be just, but it wouldn't be very loving or merciful. So what does God do? Well, in Christianity, God enters creation as Jesus of Nazareth, takes the punishment, and therefore, guess what? All sin has been punished. No sin was allowed to slide, and yet God was as loving as he could possibly be. So his love is perfect, his justice is perfect. The solution in Islam, first of all, is to reduce God's attributes. God's justice is not perfect. God's love and mercy are not perfect. They're flawed. And so they think they can get around it with that. But even then, you had people like, are you sure God can forgive me? And then it became, oh, don't worry about that. God will punish Jews and Christians for your sins in hell. And so the Islam gets around the need for the atonement that we find in Christianity. Islam gets around that by degrading God, making him a defective, limited God, and then still ends up with substitutionary atonement and saying that God's going to punish Jews and Christians for the sins of Muslims. So big difference there. Jesus takes our punishment upon himself willingly. Jews and Christians aren't doing that willingly for Muslims. And so Allah's just say, hey, here's a guy, let me punish him for what that. In other words, long story short, hijab is complaining about accountability. And yet in his religion, I'm the one who, or you may be the one of us, some Christian or Jew is going to be paying for his sins, for Ali Dawa's sins, for all these guys' sins. And they know that their prophet said that. They know the people listening don't know about any of that. And so they go and they pretend, oh, you see, Christianity has this issue. And they pretend that they don't. Yeah. So hijab, that's pure deception on hijab's part.
I think, honestly, the incarnation and atonement is just the most beautiful feature of Christianity, that God would draw near to us and be willing to suffer and die for us. And if that's something you've got questions about, we've got a couple of videos on the channel might be worth checking out. The one that's anchored on our homepage, Why Did Jesus Die?, which explores the whole theme of Good Friday in more of a spoken word format. And I think maybe our most popular video is why can't God just forgive sins without Jesus' death? And so if you want to check those out, we really wrestle with, I think, the challenge, but also the beauty of the Christian vision of atonement and what God achieves through the cross. And the reality is it does do something to change us. Like when you know that God's willing to suffer and die for you, both the weight that what you have done took the life of the most precious thing in creation and the universe to you, the Lord Jesus Christ, and then the experience of the changed nature of being so loved by God that he accepted me at my worst. He loves me at my worst. How that just transforms your life going forward from there, from this place of security. Mate, just thanks for unfolding that. We've got a couple of questions and then we'll close up that people wanted to ask away. This is from Mario Mene. It says, if no man has or can see God, doesn't say the Father, but just see God, but Christ has been seen, how is Jesus God? Also, John seems to say when Isaiah saw God in John chapter 12, he saw Jesus explaining God in John chapter 1. So I think they're trying to wrestle with this reality in John's gospel. It seems to be a contradiction. The Bible says multiple places, Old Testament and New Testament, no man has ever seen God, but then it says that Jesus is seen by us. So doesn't that seem to call into question the divinity of Jesus?
Well, I mean, keep in mind, God can appear in the Old Testament as well. God appears in the Old Testament as well. So there's no great mystery here. If you're talking about God, which I would agree with, you can't see God in terms of like God in all his glory as he is in himself. What are you talking about? God is omnipresent. Like, how would you see God in that sense? Can God appear to us in some form? Of course, Old Testament or New Testament. So this would be clear from the entire Bible, that you can't see God as he is in himself, as the one who is upholding and sustaining all of reality for every moment that it exists. And yet, can God appear to us? Of course he can.
Yeah. Appreciate that. There's this one here from L Pop Man, which says, can you please provide a list of Old Testament chapters that point to Jesus? I know some, but can you provide more for us? This might just be good for any book recommendations that kind of show that prophetic element, or the way that the Old Testament paints a portrait that Jesus fulfills.
Yeah, you can kind of, I mean, there's a lot. I mean, when you're looking at the Exodus, when you're looking at when you're looking at the Exodus and the Passover, and you read the Passover and then look at, how this plays out in the gospel, when you look at Abraham being commanded to sacrifice his son Isaac, and you just read through that passage and you start thinking about it, because the angel of the Lord is there. The angel of the Lord is there, which most Christian theologians believe is the pre-incarnate Christ. And you look at this idea of sacrificing his son, and then God stopping him because God provides his own sacrifice. It even says that God will provide his own sacrifice. And then he does it. It happens. And so this is all leading up. So as far as individual chapters, so you have Genesis 22, the Exodus, a lot of passages in the Psalms, Psalm 22, very good passage. Isaiah 53, lots of passages in Isaiah. Some people call Isaiah the Gospel of John of the Old Testament, and so on. So yeah, it kind of depends on what level you want to go into. You could go into a lot of detail, but pretty helpful, I think, to get your mind really solidly around 4 or 5 very important sections in the Old Testament.
Totally. This little book might be helpful as well. The Messiah in the Old Testament by Walter Kaiser just kind of traces the development theme of messianic hope and the different pictures that kind of fit in there. I love like the Genesis 3 stomp on the head of evil, the seed of the woman will destroy the seed of the serpent, and then kind of working through. There's just so much in Genesis itself. And then every book, there's elements you can draw from that. Tim Keller's got a number of sermons where he's walked through Old Testament just to do that as well. You can look at those fulfillments, but there's tons in there. I might just do one more if we can, David. Is there anyone that you are afraid to debate as a representative of Islam?
Oh, in Islam? No. No, there are certain people I would not debate if they're like people I have no clue who they are and have never heard of, and they have no one's listening to them or something like that. I would not be interested in debating. But as far as like actual Dawa guys, no, we'd debate any of those guys. As far as not debating, so the only people I would want to debate if is a topic I don't know anything about. So, David, would you debate this guy, this physicist on quantum mechanics? No, I don't understand. No, I don't know about quantum mechanics. I wouldn't want to debate that. But no, Islam, no, set it up.
Sounds good. And just this one big thanks to David as well. Just shout out to Defenders of the Faith. I think you've got a lot of people in the chat, mate, who appreciate kind of the work that you do. If you wanted to leave a lasting message with anyone watching this about, okay, we've talked a lot about Islam and about your own experiences and story. What's one thing that someone who's like, look, I don't know what I believe. I'm still processing. I've got questions. I've got doubts. What's one parting message you want to leave with them?
Yeah, 2 things. So Before you go down the route of pessimism and despair, you might want to take a look at the gospel message and, hey, is there a God that loved me so much that he was willing to do this? And look into that, because if that did happen, if Jesus Christ is Lord, who died on the cross for sins and rose from the dead, then what have you seriously got to worry about in this life? And you shouldn't be sad. You shouldn't be depressed. You shouldn't be miserable. So yeah, you should definitely check that out. And the flip side is it's easy to get depressed right now. It's easy to look around the world and get depressed at all the stuff that is going on. But I mean, if you're a Christian, these are awesome times. I mean, just think what we're talking about right now. You can look at the impact Islam is having on the world and go, oh my goodness, this doesn't look good. This looks bad. They're thumping their chest and you got all these terrorist attacks and so on. From the perspective of Christian evangelism, this is the greatest time in history. If you want to reach Muslims with the gospel, there is no better time in history. For 14 centuries, Muslim leaders have been able to keep Muslims pretty insulated. So they don't hear criticisms of the claims they're making about Islam, and they don't hear a serious presentation of an alternative to Islam. So they kept people in a bubble, and all of a sudden that bubble is burst. And now we have open access to Muslims around the world through the internet. And we have open access to Muslims who are moving to Western countries. And so if you want to reach Muslims with the gospel, this is the greatest time in history. So no reason for Christians to be sad and depressed during these times.
Well, mate, I really appreciate just the wisdom that you've been able to share, kind of wandering through some of these questions. And as I shared, we've got all David's links down there in the show notes. Please do follow through, subscribe, like, and check out particularly his testimony video, which we got especially linked there. It's powerful in the story it has to share. Mate, I'm just glad for the way that God has wired you and maybe uniquely with your personality to do the kind of work that you're doing. And so just appreciate you speaking into that space. If anyone wants to get in contact with David, just follow through Apologetics Roadshow and Acts 17 Apologetics would be great. Thanks so much for coming on, mate.
No problem.
No worries. And to anyone who's watching this, thanks so much for following along this far in the live stream. We here at Question Christianity always trying to help create content that's useful too. We've got a ton of short form content, particularly the sort of 5 to 10 minute videos trying to help wrestle with deep things, and then big long form where we go deeper with experts and scholars and philosophers and scientists and all the rest of it in many of the questions that you're asking about. So please do go and check out what else is on the channel. Follow us over for social media. We break that down into infographics on Instagram and on our Facebook accounts at QC Socials. And if in any way we can be helpful, please do get in contact. We'd love to help out. Otherwise, until next time, we'll see you later. Bye-bye.